Well, hello there, night wanderers. Welcome back to another episode of WTF Dreams, where we explore the absolutely bonkers intersection of sleep and history. Tonight, we're diving into something that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about military strategy. The incredible stories of generals who literally dreamed their way to victory on the battlefield. You know, before you settle in for what's probably going to be the weirdest military history lesson you've ever heard, go ahead and smash that like button if you're into these bizarre historical deep dives, and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy learning about the strange ways our ancestors' minds worked. I'm always fascinated to know, drop a comment telling me, where you're listening from and what ridiculously late hour it is where you are. It's like creating this global network of insomniacs united by historical weirdness. Now, get comfortable because tonight we're exploring how some of history's most legendary military commanders, from Alexander the Great to Napoleon Bonaparte, received their most brilliant strategies not from war councils or tactical manuals, but from the mysterious realm of dreams. And honestly, if you end up drifting off somewhere in the middle of this, that's completely fine. Actually, that's kind of the whole point here. I've been researching this topic for months, and I have to say, the idea that some of history's greatest military victories came from visions experienced during sleep is both fascinating and slightly terrifying. What if the fate of entire civilizations was decided by what someone's subconscious cooked up after a heavy dinner? Anyway, let's start with perhaps the most famous case of dream-guided warfare in ancient history. So picture this, it's 332 BCE, and Alexander the Great is basically steamrolling through the known world like a Macedonian wrecking ball. He's conquered most of Asia Minor, he's heading toward Egypt, and there's this one city that's directly in his path, Jerusalem. Now, let's back up for a second and talk about what Alexander was actually like as a person, because Hollywood tends to make him seem like some noble, philosophical warrior king. In reality, Alexander was a 24-year-old megalomaniac with daddy issues, a drinking problem, and ego so massive it could probably be seen from space. He'd been conquering cities since he was 18, and by 332 BCE, he developed a pretty standard operating procedure. Show up, demand surrender, and if they refused, turn the place into a smoking crater. It was efficient, it was brutal, and it worked. Most cities took one look at his army and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Jerusalem wasn't exactly a military powerhouse. The city's defenses were decent, but nothing that Alexander's battle-hardened army couldn't crush in an afternoon. Everyone knew it. The Greeks knew it. The Persians knew it. Hell, the people of Jerusalem definitely knew it. Alexander's army at this point was a well-oiled killing machine. He had about 35,000 men, including the famous Macedonian phalanx with their 18-foot spears, Greek hoplites, Thracian cavalry, and siege engineers who could take apart city walls like they were made of cardboard. This wasn't just an army, it was a military innovation that had revolutionized warfare. But here's where it gets weird. The night before Alexander was supposed to lay siege to the city, he had what he later described as the most vivid dream of his life. And this is a guy who'd been having epic dreams since childhood. His mother Olympias used to tell him that his father was Zeus, so vivid dreams were kind of the family business. In this dream, Alexander found himself standing in a temple unlike any Greek sanctuary he'd ever seen. Greek temples were all about marble columns and geometric perfection, but this place was different. It was all stone and gold, with an altar that seemed to pulse with divine energy. The walls were covered in symbols and writing that Alexander couldn't read but somehow understood. The atmosphere in the dream was completely different from anything Alexander had experienced. Instead of the familiar presence of Greek gods, who were basically immortal soap opera characters with superpowers, this place felt ancient and profound in a way that made Alexander feel small, which was not an emotion he was accustomed to. An old man appeared to him in the dream, dressed in white robes that seemed to shimmer with their own light. The man had a beard that reached to his chest, eyes that held the wisdom of centuries, and a presence that made Alexander, who had never bowed to anyone except his father Philip, want to kneel in reverence. The man spoke to Alexander in perfect Greek, which is convenient because Alexander's Aramaic was probably terrible. Most Macedonian nobles could barely speak proper Greek, let alone foreign languages. But in dreams, apparently, language barriers don't apply. The old man told Alexander that he was destined to conquer the Persian Empire, but that Jerusalem would play a crucial role in his victory, not just as another conquered city, but as a spiritual ally that would provide divine protection for his campaigns. Sometimes the gods provide GPS directions, even in 332 BCE. But here's the really bizarre part. The old man in Alexander's dream gave him specific tactical advice. He showed Alexander a map of the Persian Empire that was more detailed than anything Alexander's scouts had produced. The map showed weaknesses in Persian defensive positions that Alexander's intelligence network hadn't discovered, trade routes that could be exploited to cut off Persian supply lines, and even predicted the exact location where the final battle against Darius would take place. The dream map included information about Persian troop movements that were happening in real time, hundreds of miles away. It showed the locations of Persian supply depots, the loyalty levels of various Persian provincial governors, and even the psychological state of Darius III himself. Alexander could see the entire strategic situation laid out before him like a cosmic chessboard. The dream figure pointed out that the Persian Empire was actually much weaker than it appeared, held together by fear and bureaucracy rather than genuine loyalty. The key to victory wasn't just military superiority, but understanding how to exploit the psychological and political fractures within the Persian system. When Alexander woke up, he could remember every detail of the dream with photographic clarity. He could describe the old man's face, the layout of the temple, even the specific tactical formations the dream figure had shown him. But more importantly, he could recall the complete strategic framework for conquering Persia that had been revealed to him. This wasn't just a vague prophetic vision, it was a detailed military briefing that included specific information about Persian weaknesses, optimal timing for attacks, and even contingency plans for different scenarios. Alexander immediately called his generals together and began comparing the dream intelligence with their existing knowledge of Persian capabilities. The correlation was perfect. Every detail from the dream that could be verified matched their intelligence reports exactly. Information they'd been uncertain about was clarified, and gaps in their knowledge were filled with strategic insights that proved to be completely accurate. Now, Alexander was a smart guy, but he was also superstitious as hell. He'd been raised on stories about divine intervention in human affairs, and he genuinely believed that the gods took personal interest in his campaigns. The idea that he'd receive strategic guidance from a divine source wasn't just plausible to him, it was expected. He immediately called off the siege of Jerusalem and instead approached the city peacefully. This decision shocked his generals, who had been preparing for a standard siege operation. They'd already positioned the siege engines, mapped out the assault routes, and calculated how long it would take to breach the walls. But Alexander was absolutely convinced that his dream had been a genuine divine communication. He ordered his army to approach Jerusalem with peaceful intentions, displaying none of the usual intimidation tactics that preceded his sieges. What happened next sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but it's documented in multiple historical sources. Josephus, Plutarch, and the Jewish historian Josephus all recorded versions of these events. And while the details vary, the core story is consistent across all accounts. The high priest of Jerusalem, a man named Jaddua, came out to meet Alexander at the city gates. Alexander took one look at this guy and nearly fell off his horse. It was the same man from his dream. Same face, same white robes, same otherworldly presence that had commanded such respect in the dream temple. According to the historical accounts, Alexander dismounted, walked up to Jaddua and said, "I know you. You appeared to me in a dream and told me I would conquer Persia." Jaddua's response was equally mind-blowing. "I too dreamed of your coming. The God of Israel told me you would protect our people." Can you imagine that conversation? "Hey, I dreamed about you." "Oh, weird, I dreamed about you too." Like the ancient world's most consequential missed connection. It's like if you matched with someone on a dating app and then discovered you'd both been dreaming about each other for months. But it gets even weirder. Jaddua then showed Alexander prophecies from the book of Daniel that specifically mentioned a Greek king from the west who would destroy the Persian Empire. These prophecies had been written centuries earlier, but they described Alexander's campaigns with remarkable accuracy: the rapid conquest of Asia Minor, the defeat of Persian forces, even the division of the empire after Alexander's death. Alexander was so convinced by this dream prophecy combination that he not only spared Jerusalem but made offerings in the temple and declared the city under his protection. He spent 3 days in Jerusalem, consulting with Jewish scholars and learning about their religious traditions. The psychological impact of this encounter was profound. Alexander's army had expected to sack another city, but instead they witnessed their invincible commander bowing before a foreign priest and offering tribute in an alien temple. This experience reinforced Alexander's belief in his divine mission and convinced his soldiers that the gods were personally guiding their campaigns. The tactical advice from his dream proved to be devastatingly accurate. Alexander used the strategies he'd learned in his sleep to outmaneuver the Persian forces, ultimately crushing Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, exactly where his dream had predicted the decisive battle would occur. But the dream guidance went beyond just one battle. The strategic framework Alexander had received in his Jerusalem dream shaped his entire approach to conquering the Persian Empire. He understood that victory required not just military superiority, but psychological dominance and political sophistication. Alexander's subsequent campaigns reflected the insights from his dream. Instead of just conquering Persian cities, he adopted Persian customs, married Persian nobility, and integrated Persian administrators into his government. This approach, which his Macedonian generals never fully understood, was based on the dream vision that had shown him how to transform military conquest into lasting empire. The psychological warfare techniques Alexander employed, the deliberate cultivation of his divine image, the strategic use of mercy and brutality, the careful manipulation of religious symbolism, all traced back to insights he'd gained from his dream encounter with the high priest of Jerusalem. Dreams don't just happen to you. They happen through you to reshape the world. The really fascinating part is how this dream-guided strategy affected the development of Western civilization. Alexander's decision to spare Jerusalem and integrate Jewish, intellectual traditions into his empire had profound long-term consequences. Jewish scholars became part of the Hellenistic intellectual network, contributing to the philosophical and scientific developments that would eventually influence Roman culture and early Christianity. Alexander's dream-inspired approach to empire building, the idea that conquest should be followed by cultural integration, rather than simple domination, became a template for later empires. The Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and even the Islamic caliphates all employed variations of the strategic principles that Alexander had learned in his dream. The specific tactical innovations from Alexander's dream were also revolutionary. His use of psychological warfare, his understanding of the importance of supply lines and logistics, and his ability to adapt his tactics to different enemies and terrains all reflected the comprehensive, strategic education he'd received during his supernatural encounter. Modern military historians have studied Alexander's campaigns extensively, and many of his tactical innovations can be traced back to insights that first appeared after his Jerusalem dream. His ability to coordinate different types of military units, his use of terrain as a tactical advantage, and his understanding of the psychological factors that determine victory or defeat all showed dramatic improvement after his dream encounter. The dream also seems to have given Alexander a deeper understanding of the political aspects of warfare. Before Jerusalem, Alexander was primarily focused on military victory. After his dream, he understood that lasting success required political legitimacy, cultural integration, and administrative sophistication. This shift in Alexander's approach had enormous historical consequences. His post-dream campaigns created not just a military empire, but a cultural and intellectual fusion that shaped the entire ancient world. The Hellenistic civilization that emerged from Alexander's conquest was a direct result of the strategic insights he'd gained from his dream encounter with the high priest of Jerusalem. What's really remarkable is how Alexander's dream-guided strategy influenced military thinking for centuries after his death. Roman generals studied his campaigns, medieval military theorists analyzed his tactics, and modern military academies still teach principles that Alexander first learned in a dream about meeting a Jewish priest. The psychological impact of Alexander's dream extended beyond military strategy. His encounter with the high priest of Jerusalem convinced him that he was genuinely divinely guided, which gave him the confidence to attempt increasingly ambitious campaigns. Without this supernatural validation, Alexander might never have attempted the conquest of India or the integration of Persian and Greek cultures. The dream also influenced Alexander's understanding of leadership. Before Jerusalem, he led through fear and charisma. After his dream, he understood that true leadership required wisdom, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to inspire loyalty across different ethnic and religious groups. This evolution in Alexander's leadership style created a new model for imperial governance that would influence political development for centuries. The idea that a ruler should be both militarily powerful and culturally sophisticated, both feared and respected, both Greek and cosmopolitan, all originated from insights Alexander gained in his dream about meeting the high priest of Jerusalem. The really wild part is that Alexander's dream encounter had lasting theological implications. The meeting between Alexander and Jaddua became part of Jewish historical tradition, influencing how Judaism understood its relationship with secular power. The idea that God could work through foreign rulers to protect his people became an important theme in Jewish thought that would later influence Christianity and Islam. Alexander's dream also contributed to the development of the concept of divine kingship that would dominate political thought for millennia. The idea that rulers receive their authority directly from divine sources rather than from human institutions was reinforced by Alexander's dream encounter and became a foundational principle of imperial ideology. What's fascinating is how a single dream experience could have such profound historical consequences. Alexander's vision in Jerusalem shaped military strategy, political theory, cultural development, and religious thought in ways that are still visible today. It's a reminder that individual psychological experiences can have effects that ripple through history for thousands of years. The dream guidance Alexander received also demonstrates the complex relationship between individual psychology and historical causation. Without Alexander's dream, would the Persian Empire have fallen? Would Hellenistic culture have developed? Would the intellectual foundations of Western civilization have been laid? It's impossible to know, but it's clear that one man's dream experience had consequences that shaped the entire trajectory of human civilization. Moving forward about 1,700 years, we get to one of the most famous cases of dream-guided warfare in European history, Joan of Arc. But forget everything you think you know about her story, because the real details are way weirder than any Hollywood movie. First, let's set the scene properly. It's 1429, and France is basically a complete disaster. The 100 Years' War has been going on for, well, almost 100 years, and England is winning. Hard. The English have conquered most of northern France. They control the seas. And they've got this psychological stranglehold on French morale that's almost as effective as their military superiority. The French are so demoralized that they're essentially a nation of people who've given up hope. King Charles VII hasn't even been properly crowned because the English control Reims, where French kings are supposed to be coronated. He's essentially a king in waiting, holed up in Chinon Castle like a medieval version of a government in exile. Now, Joan of Arc wasn't just some random peasant girl who heard voices, despite what most people think. She was 17 years old, came from a relatively prosperous farming family in Domremy, and had been having incredibly detailed strategic dreams about specific battles months before they happened. Her visions weren't vague religious experiences, they were detailed. Military intelligence reports delivered by what she claimed were saints. The first major dream came in January 1429, when Joan was still working on her family's farm. She dreamed about the siege of Orleans, a city that wasn't even under siege yet. The English hadn't even begun moving their forces toward Orleans, but Joan saw the entire siege scenario playing out in her sleep with perfect clarity. In her dream, she saw English forces surrounding the city, cutting off supply lines and slowly starving the French defenders. She could see the exact positions where the English would build their siege, Fortifications, structures called bastilles that were essentially fortified camps designed to control access to the city. But here's the bizarre part. Joan's dream included specific details about the English fortifications that wouldn't be built for another 3 months. She described the locations of their siege towers, the positioning of their cannons, even the color of the banners flying over their camps. She knew which English commanders would be responsible for different sections of the siege, what their tactical weaknesses were, and even predicted the weather conditions that would affect the siege operations. Joan was so convinced by the vividness of her dream that she started making detailed drawings of the siege layout. Her family thought she was losing her mind. Their teenage daughter was obsessively sketching military fortifications and muttering about English battle tactics like some kind of medieval war nerd. The dream visions continued with increasing intensity throughout early 1429. Joan would wake up with detailed knowledge of English military capabilities, French defensive weaknesses, and tactical opportunities that she had no earthly way of knowing. She could describe the interior layout of castles she'd never seen, the personalities of military commanders she'd never met, and the morale problems of armies she'd never encountered. Her parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy, were terrified that their daughter was either going insane or being possessed by demons. Medieval people took supernatural experiences seriously, but they also understood that such experiences could be either divine or demonic in origin. Joan's behavior was so unusual that they consulted with the local priest, who was equally baffled by her detailed military knowledge. When Joan finally convinced her uncle to take her to the French court, she immediately started giving tactical advice based on her dreams. She told the French commanders exactly where the English would place their artillery, which gates would be most vulnerable to attack, and even predicted the exact date when the English would attempt their final assault on Orleans. The French military leaders initially thought she was completely insane. Who was this 17-year-old farm girl to tell experienced knights how to conduct a siege? These were men who had been fighting the English for decades, who understood siege warfare from practical experience, and who had access to the best military intelligence that 15th century France could provide. But Joan's predictions kept proving accurate. She knew things about English battle tactics that experienced French spies hadn't been able to discover. She could predict English troop movements with uncanny precision, anticipate their strategic decisions, and even forecast their supply problems before they became apparent to English commanders themselves. Sometimes the best military intelligence comes from the most unexpected sources. The really disturbing part was how Joan described receiving this information. She claimed that St. Michael, the Archangel, St. Margaret, and St. Catherine would appear to her in dreams and provide detailed tactical briefings. These weren't gentle, peaceful religious visions. They were hardcore military strategy sessions conducted by supernatural beings who understood 15th century warfare better than any human general. According to Joan's own testimony, St. Michael would appear to her as a warrior in golden armor, carrying maps and battle plans that showed French forces how to exploit English weaknesses. St. Margaret would provide intelligence about English morale and supply problems. St. Catherine would reveal the psychological vulnerabilities of specific English commanders. These dream saints didn't just give Joan vague encouragement, they provided specific, tactical information that included optimal timing for attacks, recommended troop formations, and even advised on psychological warfare techniques. Joan would wake up with detailed knowledge of siege engineering, cavalry tactics, and artillery positioning that she couldn't have acquired through normal means. The French court was initially skeptical, but Joan's knowledge was so specific and accurate that they eventually decided to test her tactical insights. They gave her a small military role in the relief of Orleans, expecting her to fail spectacularly and prove that her visions were delusions. Instead, Joan's dream-guided strategy worked perfectly. She knew exactly where the English were weakest, when they would be most vulnerable to attack, and how to coordinate French forces for maximum psychological impact. The siege of Orleans, which had been expected to result in French defeat, turned into a stunning victory that shocked both French and English forces. But Joan's most incredible dream-guided victory came during the Battle of Patay in June 1429. The night before the battle, She had a dream where she saw the exact location where the English army would be positioned, the direction they would retreat, and even the specific moment when their formation would break. In her dream, Joan found herself flying above the battlefield like a bird, able to see the entire tactical situation from an impossible perspective. She could see not just the positions of troops, but their psychological states, which units were confident, which were demoralized, which commanders were making good decisions, and which were paralyzed by fear. The dream showed her that the English army was more psychologically fragile than anyone realized. Their recent defeats had undermined their confidence, and their commanders were making defensive decisions based on fear rather than tactical logic. Joan saw exactly how to exploit this psychological weakness to achieve maximum tactical advantage. She woke up and immediately started drawing maps of the battlefield, terrain she'd never seen in her waking life. Her drawings were so accurate that when French scouts later reconnoitered the area, they found that Joan's sketches matched the actual geography perfectly. She knew where every tree, every hill, every stream would be located, and she could predict how these geographical features would affect the battle. Joan's battle plan was so detailed that it included contingencies for weather changes, alternate routes for flanking maneuvers, and even backup strategies in case the English responded differently than expected. She had somehow anticipated every possible tactical scenario and developed appropriate responses. The French forces followed Joan's dream-based strategy exactly, and it resulted in one of the most decisive victories of the 100 Years' War. The English lost over 2,000 men while French casualties were minimal. It was such a complete tactical victory that English morale never fully recovered, and the psychological impact helped turn the tide of the entire war. But Joan's dreams weren't just about tactics. They were prophetic in ways that went far beyond military strategy. She accurately predicted her own capture at Compiègne, describing in detail the exact circumstances of her imprisonment months before it happened. She knew she would be betrayed by allies, captured during a specific type of military operation, and handed over to English authorities. Joan's prophetic dreams also included visions of her trial and execution. She described the courtroom where she would be tried, the faces of her accusers, and even the political pressures that would lead to her condemnation. She knew she would be accused of heresy and witchcraft, and she understood that her execution would be used as psychological warfare against French resistance. The really haunting part is that Joan's final dream, which she described to her confessor the night before her execution, was about the eventual French victory over the English. She saw the coronation of Charles VII, the recapture of French territories, and the end of English occupation, all of which happened exactly as she had dreamed, years after her death. In this final vision, Joan saw herself not as a tragic victim, but as a catalyst for French national awakening. She understood that her martyrdom would be more powerful than her military victories in inspiring French resistance and undermining English morale. The psychological impact of Joan's dream-guided campaigns extended far beyond their immediate military consequences. Her victories proved that the English could be beaten, that French resistance was possible, and that divine intervention might be supporting French independence. Joan's success also revolutionized medieval thinking about the relationship between divine inspiration and military strategy. Before Joan, most people accepted that God might provide general guidance to righteous causes, but the idea that saints would provide specific tactical intelligence was unprecedented. The detailed nature of Joan's military dreams challenged conventional understanding of how divine communication worked. Medieval theologians struggled to explain how a teenage peasant girl could receive tactical information that surpassed the knowledge of experienced military commanders. Joan's dream-guided victories also had profound implications for medieval concepts of gender and authority. The idea that a young woman could receive divine military guidance that trumped the expertise of male military professionals was revolutionary and threatening to established social hierarchies. The English response to Joan's success reveals how seriously they took her claim of divine guidance. They invested enormous resources in capturing her alive, and they conducted an elaborate trial designed to prove that her visions were demonic rather than divine. They understood that Joan's psychological impact on French morale was as dangerous as her military capabilities. Joan's execution was itself a form of psychological warfare designed to undermine French belief in divine support for their cause. The English hoped that by proving Joan was a heretic and witch, they could destroy the morale boost that her victories had provided to French forces. But the English strategy backfired spectacularly. Joan's martyrdom created exactly the psychological effect she had foreseen in her final dream. Instead of undermining French morale, her execution inspired more resistance and convinced many French people that they were fighting a holy war against foreign oppression. Sometimes the most complete victories are the ones that don't require killing your enemies. The tactical innovations Joan introduced based on her dream visions influenced European military development for centuries. Her understanding of psychological warfare, her ability to coordinate different types of military units, and her use of mobility and surprise tactics became standard elements of military strategy. Joan's dream-guided approach to siege warfare was particularly influential. Her understanding that sieges were psychological as well as physical contests, and her ability to maintain morale during extended military operations became fundamental principles of siege defense. The intelligence-gathering techniques implied by Joan's dream visions also influenced military thinking. While medieval commanders couldn't replicate her supernatural information sources, they could adopt her systematic approach to understanding enemy psychology and predicting enemy behavior. Joan's success demonstrated that military victory required more than just superior numbers or better equipment. Her dream-guided strategies showed that understanding enemy psychology, maintaining friendly morale, and exploiting tactical opportunities were equally important factors in determining battle outcomes. The religious implications of Joan's military dreams continued to influence Christian thinking about divine intervention in human affairs. Her story became a template for understanding how God might work through unlikely individuals to achieve historical purposes. Joan's canonization by the Catholic Church in 1920 officially recognized her visions as authentic divine communications, validating the idea that military strategy could be a form of religious mission. This recognition had profound implications for Christian attitudes toward warfare and divine guidance. The nationalist implications of Joan's story were equally significant. Her dream-guided campaign became a foundational myth for a French national identity, demonstrating that divine providence supported French independence and cultural distinctiveness. Joan's story also influenced European thinking about the relationship between popular will and political authority. Her ability to bypass traditional military and political hierarchies through divine inspiration became a model for later revolutionary movements. The psychological warfare techniques Joan developed based on her dream visions became standard elements of military strategy. Her understanding that battlefield success required both physical and psychological victory influenced military thinking for centuries. Modern military historians continue to study Joan's campaigns as examples of how psychological factors can determine military outcomes. Her dream-guided strategies demonstrated principles of morale, leadership, and tactical flexibility that remain relevant to contemporary military thinking. The really fascinating aspect of Joan's story is how her dream visions provided not just tactical guidance, but a complete strategic framework for understanding the political and psychological dimensions of warfare. Her supernatural intelligence sources gave her insights into enemy psychology that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional means. Joan's dreams also provided her with the psychological confidence necessary to challenge established military and political authorities. Without her conviction that she was receiving divine guidance, she would never have had the courage to approach the French court or to contradict experienced military commanders. The transformative impact of Joan's dream-guided campaigns demonstrates how individual psychological experiences can have historical consequences that extend far beyond their immediate context. Her visions didn't just influence military tactics, they reshaped French national identity, Christian theology, and European political development. Now let's talk about Napoleon Bonaparte, who had what might be the most strategically complex dream in military history. This happened during his Egyptian campaign in 1798, when he was still a relatively young general trying to make his mark on the world. But first, let me give you some context about what Napoleon was actually doing in Egypt, because it wasn't just some random military adventure. This was one of the most ambitious and bizarre campaigns in military history, a French army invading Egypt to threaten British trade routes to India. It was like trying to attack someone by going through their neighbor's backyard. Except the neighbor lived on a different continent and the backyard was full of sand, disease, and very angry locals. Napoleon was 29 years old in 1798, and he was already showing signs of the megalomaniacal genius that would later reshape Europe. He'd proven himself as a military commander in Italy, but the Egyptian campaign was his first independent command of a major expedition. The pressure was enormous. If he succeeded, he'd be the hero who struck a decisive blow against British power. If he failed, he'd be the idiot who wasted an entire army in the desert. The French Directory had approved this campaign partly because they wanted to hurt Britain, but also because they wanted to get Napoleon out of Paris. He was becoming too popular, too ambitious, and too dangerous for the politicians who were supposedly running France. Sending him to Egypt was like giving a hyperactive child a really complicated puzzle. It kept him busy and far away from more important things. Napoleon had been struggling with logistics in the Egyptian desert for months. His army was dealing with supply shortages that would make a modern quartermaster weep. They were running out of food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies. The heat was killing soldiers faster than enemy action. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, typhus, and plague were decimating his forces. The local population was becoming increasingly hostile. The French had initially been welcomed as liberators from Ottoman rule, but Napoleon's soldiers had quickly worn out their welcome through the traditional military practices of looting, harassment, and cultural insensitivity. Egyptian resistance was growing stronger and more organized every day. To make matters worse, the British Royal Navy had destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, cutting off Napoleon's supply lines and stranding his army in a hostile land. Admiral Nelson's victory had turned what was supposed to be a quick campaign into a potential disaster that could end Napoleon's career before it really began. The campaign was turning into a logistical nightmare, and Napoleon was starting to worry that his career might be over before it really began. He was thousands of miles from France, cut off from reinforcements, surrounded by enemies, and dealing with an army that was becoming increasingly demoralized and unreliable. On the night of August 12, 1798, camped near the pyramids of Giza, Napoleon had what he later described as a dream that changed everything. He'd been studying the pyramids for days, fascinated by their ancient majesty and wondering about the civilization that had built them. Like many educated Europeans of his era, Napoleon was obsessed with ancient history and saw himself as heir to the great conquerors of the past. In this dream, Napoleon found himself inside one of the pyramids, but not in any chamber that archaeologists had discovered. This was a vast underground space filled with maps and scrolls that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The walls were covered with hieroglyphics that Napoleon couldn't read, but somehow understood. The entire space felt alive with ancient wisdom and power. The atmosphere was unlike anything Napoleon had experienced. The air itself seemed to pulse with knowledge and authority. Torches burned without smoke, casting light that revealed details with impossible clarity. The floor was made of polished stone that reflected the light like a mirror, creating the illusion that Napoleon was walking on starlight. In the dream, he was approached by three figures: Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Charlemagne. These weren't just random historical figures, they were Napoleon's personal heroes, the military leaders he studied obsessively and tried to emulate. Their appearance in his dream was like receiving tactical advice from a supernatural council of war. Julius Caesar appeared first, dressed in the purple robes of a Roman emperor, but carrying the simple weapons of a soldier. He spoke to Napoleon in perfect French, which was convenient since Napoleon's Latin was probably limited to military terminology and legal phrases he'd picked up during his legal training. Dream Caesar showed Napoleon detailed plans for not just conquering Egypt, but for reshaping the entire geopolitical structure of Europe and the Middle East. He revealed how Egypt could be used as a stepping stone to threaten British trade routes to India. How control of the Eastern Mediterranean could leverage power in European politics, and how military success in exotic locations could build the kind of legendary reputation that transcended normal political limitations. But Caesar's advice went beyond grand strategy. He showed Napoleon specific tactical innovations for desert warfare, how to manage water supplies, how to deal with heat exhaustion, how to motivate troops who were fighting far from home in alien conditions. The Dream Caesar had somehow mastered the logistics of desert campaigning and was sharing this knowledge with Napoleon. Alexander the Great appeared next, still young and golden-haired, wearing the armor he'd worn during his conquest of the Persian Empire. Alexander's dream wisdom focused on the psychological aspects of commanding multinational armies and conquering foreign cultures. Dream Alexander demonstrated tactics for desert warfare that could be adapted to European battlefields. He showed Napoleon how to use mobility and surprise to overcome larger forces, how to exploit enemy psychology to achieve victory before battles even began, and how to maintain discipline and morale among troops who were fighting in conditions they'd never experienced. But Alexander's most important teaching was about the relationship between military conquest and cultural integration. He showed Napoleon that lasting victory required not just defeating enemies, but understanding them, adapting to their strengths, and incorporating their wisdom into his own strategic thinking. Alexander's dream lessons included specific advice about dealing with different types of enemies, how to fight British regulars, Austrian professionals, Russian masses, and Prussian disciplinarians. Each enemy type required different tactical approaches and psychological strategies. Charlemagne appeared last, massive and imposing, wearing the crown of the Holy Roman Empire but carrying the sword of a Frankish warrior. Charlemagne's dream wisdom focused on the political strategies needed to transform military success into lasting empire. Dream Charlemagne revealed the administrative and legal frameworks necessary for governing conquered territories. He showed Napoleon how to balance central authority with local autonomy, how to integrate different legal systems, and how to create institutions that could survive dynastic changes. But Charlemagne's most crucial advice was about timing and patience. He showed Napoleon that empire building required not just military victories, but the wisdom to know when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to consolidate gains before attempting further expansion. Sometimes the best military advisors are the ones who've been dead for centuries. But here's where it gets really weird. The dream included specific details about future battles that Napoleon hadn't even planned yet. He saw himself at Austerlitz, commanding French forces against a coalition of Austrian and Russian armies. He could see the exact terrain, the positioning of enemy forces, and the tactical maneuvers that would lead to victory. The dream showed him the Battle of Jena, where he would crush Prussian forces using tactics that hadn't been invented yet. He saw Wagram, where he would defeat Austrian forces through innovations in artillery coordination and infantry tactics. These weren't vague prophetic visions, they were detailed tactical briefings that included specific information about enemy capabilities, optimal timing for attacks, and even contingency plans for different scenarios. Napoleon could see how each battle would unfold, what mistakes his enemies would make, and how to exploit their weaknesses. The dream generals also showed him the psychological techniques that would become his signature approach to warfare. They taught him that battles were won in the mind before they were fought on the battlefield, that enemy morale was more important than enemy numbers, and that the appearance of invincibility was often more valuable than actual invincibility. Napoleon learned how to use propaganda, how to cultivate his own legend, and how to manipulate enemy psychology through strategic positioning and timing. These weren't just military tactics, they were comprehensive approaches to psychological warfare that would influence European politics for decades. The dream also included disturbing visions of Napoleon's ultimate defeat and exile. He saw the Russian campaign, the disaster at Leipzig, the abdication and exile to Elba. The dream generals showed him that his empire would eventually fall, but they also revealed that his influence on European civilization would be permanent. This prophetic aspect of the dream was perhaps the most unsettling. Napoleon was receiving tactical guidance that would make him victorious, but he was also being shown that his victories would ultimately lead to his downfall. It was like getting a complete strategic education with a built-in expiration date. Napoleon woke up with a complete strategic framework for European conquest that would guide his actions for the next 15 years. He immediately began implementing the tactical innovations he'd learned in his sleep, starting with a brilliant series of maneuvers that turned his failing Egyptian campaign into a strategic victory. The first change was in Napoleon's approach to logistics. Using techniques the Dream Caesar had shown him, Napoleon reorganized his supply systems to be more efficient and less dependent on external support. He implemented water conservation measures, improved medical care, and restructured his foraging operations to reduce dependence on local cooperation. The psychological warfare techniques Napoleon learned in his dream became his signature approach. He understood that battles were won in the mind before they were fought on the battlefield. His ability to demoralize enemies through strategic positioning and timing, skills he attributed to his pyramid dream, became legendary throughout Europe. Napoleon's post-dream campaigns showed dramatic improvements in his ability to coordinate different types of military units. The Dream Alexander had shown him how to use infantry, cavalry, and artillery in combination to create tactical effects that were greater than the sum of their parts. But perhaps the most significant change was in Napoleon's strategic thinking. Before the dream, he was focused primarily on tactical victory. After the dream, he understood that military success was meaningless without political consolidation and administrative competence. Napoleon immediately began implementing the administrative reforms that Dream Charlemagne had shown him. He established the legal frameworks that would become the Napoleonic Code, created educational institutions that would survive his empire, and developed bureaucratic systems that could function independently of military control. The dream guidance also influenced Napoleon's approach to international relations. He understood that European conquest required not just military victories, but diplomatic sophistication and the ability to exploit political divisions among his enemies. What's really fascinating is that Napoleon's later memoirs, written on St. Helena, include detailed references to this dream and how it shaped his entire military philosophy. He wrote that the dream generals had shown him that war is not about killing enemies, but about convincing them they're already defeated. Napoleon's memoirs also reveal that he continued to have dreams about his ancient mentors throughout his career. Before major battles, he would often dream about receiving tactical advice from Caesar, Alexander, or Charlemagne. These dream consultations became an integral part of his strategic planning process. The strategic concepts from Napoleon's dream influenced European warfare for generations. His understanding of combined arms tactics, his use of psychological warfare, and his integration of military and political strategy all originated from insights he claimed to have received from dead generals in an ancient Egyptian tomb. Napoleon's tactical innovations were so effective that they were studied and adopted by military academies throughout Europe. His enemies were forced to develop new tactical approaches specifically designed to counter the techniques he'd learned in his dream. But the dream guidance also revealed the psychological vulnerabilities that would eventually lead to Napoleon's downfall. The dream generals had shown him that his greatest strength, his ability to inspire absolute loyalty, would become his greatest weakness when that loyalty was tested by impossible demands. Napoleon's Russian campaign, which led to his first major defeat, was conducted using strategies that directly contradicted the advice he'd received in his pyramid dream. His decision to invade Russia was based on political pressure and personal ego rather than the strategic wisdom his dream mentors had provided. The psychological warfare techniques Napoleon developed based on his dream visions continued to influence military thinking long after his death. His understanding that morale and perception were often more important than material advantages became fundamental principles of modern military strategy. Napoleon's administrative innovations, which he attributed to Dream Charlemagne's guidance, had even more lasting influence than his military tactics. The legal, educational, and bureaucratic systems he created survived his empire and became models for political development throughout Europe and beyond. Sometimes the most practical solutions come from the most impractical sources. The really remarkable aspect of Napoleon's dream experience is how it provided him with both tactical knowledge and strategic wisdom. He didn't just learn how to win battles, he learned how to build and maintain an empire, how to balance military conquest with political legitimacy, and how to create institutions that could survive political changes. Napoleon's dream also gave him a deeper understanding of his own psychological limitations. The dream generals had shown him that his ambition and ego would ultimately lead to his downfall. But they also revealed that his influence on European civilization would be permanent. The prophetic aspects of Napoleon's dream were perhaps the most psychologically challenging. He was receiving guidance that would make him temporarily successful, but he was also being shown that his ultimate defeat was inevitable. This created a complex psychological dynamic where Napoleon was simultaneously confident and fatalistic. Napoleon's dream experience also influenced his understanding of leadership and authority. The dream generals had shown him that true leadership required not just military competence, but cultural sophistication, administrative ability, and psychological insight. The techniques Napoleon learned for managing multinational armies and governing diverse populations all originated from his dream encounter with Alexander the Great. His ability to adapt his leadership style to different cultural contexts became one of his most important political skills. Napoleon's dream-guided approach to empire building influenced European political development for centuries. His understanding that lasting political power required legal legitimacy, administrative competence, and cultural integration became foundational principles of modern state building. The psychological warfare innovations Napoleon developed based on his dream visions also had lasting influence on military thinking. His understanding that enemy morale was often more important than enemy numbers became a fundamental principle of modern military strategy. Napoleon's use of propaganda, his cultivation of his own legend, and his manipulation of enemy psychology through strategic positioning and timing all originated from techniques he'd learned in his pyramid dream. These approaches to psychological warfare became standard elements of military strategy that are still studied in military academies today. The really fascinating aspect of Napoleon's story is how his dream experience provided him with a complete educational framework for understanding the relationship between military, political, and cultural power. He didn't just learn tactics, he learned how to think strategically about the complex relationship between warfare and civilization. Napoleon's dream also gave him a unique perspective on his own place in history. He understood that he was both creating and participating in historical developments that would influence European civilization for centuries. This historical consciousness influenced his decision-making and gave him the confidence to attempt increasingly ambitious projects. The administrative and legal innovations Napoleon implemented based on his dream guidance had profound influences on European political development. His legal codes, educational systems, and bureaucratic structures became models for political modernization throughout Europe and beyond. Napoleon's dream experience demonstrates how individual psychological events can have historical consequences that extend far beyond their immediate context. His supernatural education influenced military strategy, political theory, legal development, and cultural change in ways that are still visible today. The really remarkable thing about Napoleon's pyramid dream is how it provided him with both the knowledge and the psychological confidence necessary to reshape European civilization. Without this supernatural validation of his ambitions, Napoleon might never have attempted the conquests that made him one of history's most influential figures. Let's go back to one of the most audacious military maneuvers in ancient history, Hannibal's crossing of the Alps during the Second Punic War. What most people don't know is that this seemingly impossible strategy came to Hannibal in a dream. But first, let me set the stage for just how insane this whole situation was. It's 218 BCE, and Carthage is basically playing the ancient world's most dangerous game of poker with Rome. These two civilizations have been circling each other like heavyweight boxers for decades, and everyone knows that eventually one of them is going to have to knock the other out completely. Hannibal was 39 years old and had been preparing for this moment his entire life. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had made him swear a blood oath when he was just 9 years old to never be a friend to Rome. Imagine making that kind of promise as a kid. Hey son, Promise me you'll spend your entire adult life trying to destroy the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean. Talk about pressure. The strategic situation was completely hopeless from a conventional military perspective. Rome had massive advantages in almost every category that mattered. They had larger armies. The Romans could field about 700,000 men compared to Carthage's 300,000. They had better supplies with access to the agricultural wealth of Italy and Sicily. They controlled the seas thanks to their superior naval technology and experienced admirals. Rome also had something even more valuable. They had allies. The Roman system of alliances meant that they could call on dozens of Italian city-states for support, while Carthage was essentially isolated. Most of Rome's allies were actually conquered peoples who had been given a choice between cooperation and annihilation. But the practical result was the same. Rome had access to enormous reserves of manpower and resources. Carthage, on the other hand, was basically a trading empire that had gotten too big for its britches. They were excellent sailors and shrewd businessmen, but their military capabilities were limited. Most of their armies were made up of mercenaries, professional soldiers who fought for pay rather than patriotism. These mercenaries were often more skilled than citizen soldiers, but their loyalty was questionable and their costs were enormous. Hannibal was facing the most critical decision of his military career. A conventional campaign would be suicide. The Romans expected him to either attack from the sea, which would mean naval battles that Carthage would probably lose, or to advance through southern France and attack Italy from the north through well-defended mountain passes that the Romans had fortified for exactly this purpose. Both approaches would play to Roman strengths. A naval campaign would give Rome the advantage of fighting on familiar terrain with superior naval forces. A conventional land campaign would allow the Romans to use their superior numbers and defensive positions to wear down Carthaginian forces before they could threaten anything important. Hannibal needed something completely unexpected, something so crazy that the Romans would never see it coming. He needed a strategy that would bypass Roman advantages and create psychological shock that would be as devastating as any military defeat. The night before finalizing his campaign plans, Hannibal had a dream that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He'd been studying maps and intelligence reports for weeks, trying to find some weakness in Roman defenses, some opportunity that his enemies had overlooked. In his dream, Hannibal found himself standing at the base of impossibly tall mountains, covered in snow and ice that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The peaks stretched up so high that they disappeared into clouds that looked more like divine mist than normal weather. The entire landscape felt alien and hostile, but also somehow sacred. The air in the dream was thin and cold, making each breath feel like an effort. The silence was profound, no birds, no wind, no sounds of human activity. It was like standing at the edge of the world in a place where normal rules didn't apply. A figure appeared to him, a young man with golden hair and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. The figure wore simple traveling clothes, but moved with the grace and confidence of someone who belonged in this impossible landscape. Hannibal later identified this figure as the god Mercury, the messenger of the gods and the patron of travelers. In the dream, this divine messenger told him that victory over Rome would come not through conventional warfare, but through a journey that would seem impossible to everyone else. Mercury spoke in perfect Punic, but his words carried meanings that went beyond normal language. Hannibal understood not just what Mercury was saying, but why he was saying it and what it meant for the future of the Mediterranean world. The dream Mercury showed him specific routes through the Alps, pointing out passes that hadn't been mapped by any human explorer. He revealed weather patterns that would affect the timing of the crossing, seasonal changes that would determine when the passes would be accessible, and even the psychological impact his arrival would have on Roman forces. But this wasn't just geographical information. Mercury was providing a complete strategic education. He showed Hannibal how the Alps weren't just a physical barrier, but a psychological one. The Romans believed that their mountain barriers made them invincible, that no enemy could threaten them from the north because the Alps were impassable for large armies. Sometimes the gods provide the world's most terrifying travel itinerary. The dream Mercury explained that Romans were psychologically dependent on their sense of security. They'd built their entire strategic doctrine around the assumption that Italy was naturally defended by geography. By crossing the Alps, Hannibal wouldn't just be moving his army, he'd be shattering Roman confidence and proving that nowhere was safe from Carthaginian power. But the dream wasn't just about psychology, it was about survival. Mercury showed Hannibal exactly how to modify his equipment for mountain warfare, how to protect his soldiers from altitude sickness and exposure, and how to manage logistics in terrain where normal supply lines would be impossible. The dream included incredibly specific tactical details that went far beyond what any human scout could have discovered. Hannibal saw exactly how to manage his elephants in freezing conditions. These were African elephants that had never experienced snow, but Mercury showed him techniques for protecting them from cold and maintaining their effectiveness as psychological weapons. Mercury also revealed the psychological challenges his troops would face during the crossing. He showed Hannibal how to maintain morale when soldiers were dying from exposure, how to prevent panic when the army was trapped in narrow passes, and how to maintain discipline when traditional military structure was breaking down under extreme conditions. The dream guidance included specific information about tribal politics in the Alps. Mercury showed Hannibal which Celtic tribes would be allies, which would be enemies, and which could be bought or intimidated. This intelligence was crucial because the Alpine crossing would be impossible without some level of cooperation from local populations. But perhaps the most important aspect of the dream was Mercury's explanation of how the crossing would affect Roman psychology. He showed Hannibal that the Romans were so convinced of their invulnerability that they had no contingency plans for an invasion from the north. The psychological shock of Hannibal's arrival would be so severe that Roman forces would be essentially paralyzed for months. Mercury also revealed that the crossing itself would become legendary, regardless of its ultimate military outcome. He showed Hannibal that the audacity of the Alpine crossing would inspire fear in Roman enemies and admiration in future generations. The psychological impact would extend far beyond the immediate military campaign. The dream included disturbing visions of the cost of the crossing. Mercury showed Hannibal exactly how many men he would lose, which units would suffer the most casualties, and how the survivors would be psychologically affected by their ordeal. But he also revealed that these losses would be strategically necessary to achieve the psychological impact that would make victory possible. When Hannibal woke up, he immediately began implementing the strategy from his dream. He started modifying his army's equipment according to Mercury's specifications, training his men for mountain conditions using techniques he'd learned in his sleep, and planning supply routes that followed the exact paths he'd seen in his dream. The modifications were extensive and expensive. Hannibal had to redesign his army's equipment for alpine conditions, lighter armor that would provide mobility without sacrificing protection, cold weather clothing that would keep soldiers functional in sub-zero temperatures, and specialized equipment for mountain warfare that had never been used before. The elephant preparation was particularly complex. Hannibal had 37 war elephants, and Mercury's dream guidance had shown him exactly how to protect them from cold and altitude. He developed special protective coverings, modified their training to prepare them for mountain terrain, and created specialized feeding programs to maintain their health during the crossing. But perhaps the most important preparation was psychological. Hannibal had to prepare his soldiers for an ordeal that would test their physical and mental limits. Using techniques Mercury had shown him, he developed training programs that would build the psychological resilience necessary for the Alpine crossing. The crossing itself was a nightmare. Thousands of men died, most of the elephants were lost, and the army that emerged from the Alps was a fraction of what had entered. Hannibal had started with about 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. By the time he reached the Po Valley, he had about 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and only one surviving elephant. But the psychological impact was exactly what the dream had predicted. Roman forces were so shocked by Hannibal's appearance that they were essentially paralyzed for months. The Romans had no contingency plans for an invasion from the north, and their entire strategic doctrine had to be rebuilt from scratch. The psychological paralysis extended beyond military considerations. Roman civilians were terrified. Roman allies began to question their loyalty, and Roman politicians were thrown into panic. The idea that Hannibal could appear in northern Italy with a functioning army was so shocking that it undermined Roman confidence in their entire strategic system. Roman commanders who had been supremely confident in their defensive positions suddenly found themselves dealing with an enemy who had demonstrated the ability to do the impossible. The psychological advantage this gave Hannibal was more valuable than any tactical superiority he might have achieved through conventional means. Hannibal's dream-guided strategy led to a series of devastating victories at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae. These battles were so tactically brilliant that they're still studied by military strategists today. The psychological warfare techniques Hannibal learned in his dream, the importance of doing the unexpected, of attacking enemy confidence rather than just enemy forces, became foundational principles of military strategy. The Battle of Trebia was fought in December 280 BCE, just months after Hannibal's arrival in Italy. The Roman consul Sempronius was so eager to defeat Hannibal before his colleague, Scipio, could arrive that he fell into exactly the kind of psychological trap Mercury had shown Hannibal how to create. Hannibal used his understanding of Roman psychology to manipulate Sempronius into attacking under conditions that favored Carthaginian forces. The Romans were so shocked by Hannibal's presence that they made tactical decisions based on emotion rather than strategy. The Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE was even more devastating. Hannibal used the terrain and weather conditions exactly as Mercury had shown him in his dream, creating an ambush that destroyed an entire Roman army. The psychological impact was so severe that Roman commanders became afraid to engage Hannibal in direct combat. But the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE was Hannibal's masterpiece. Using tactical innovations that he attributed to his dream guidance, Hannibal achieved what military historians consider the most perfect tactical victory in ancient warfare. The psychological warfare techniques he'd learned from Mercury allowed him to manipulate Roman commanders into making exactly the mistakes he needed them to make. The psychological warfare techniques Hannibal learned in his dream, the importance of doing the unexpected, of attacking enemy confidence rather than just enemy forces, became foundational principles of military strategy that influenced military thinking for centuries. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to make them defeat themselves. But the dream guidance also revealed the psychological vulnerabilities that would eventually lead to Hannibal's defeat. Mercury had shown him that his greatest strength, his ability to inspire absolute loyalty in his soldiers, would become his greatest weakness when those soldiers were fighting far from home without hope of reinforcement. The dream had also revealed that Hannibal's tactical brilliance would ultimately be undermined by strategic limitations. Mercury had shown him that individual battles could be won through superior tactics, but that wars were won through superior resources and political support. Hannibal's inability to capture Rome, despite his military victories, was not a failure of tactics but a limitation of strategy. His dream guidance had given him the knowledge to win battles, but not the political wisdom to transform military success into lasting victory. The psychological warfare innovations Hannibal developed based on his dream visions continued to influence military thinking long after his death. His understanding that enemy morale was often more important than enemy numbers became a fundamental principle of military strategy that is still taught in military academies today. Hannibal's use of terrain, weather, and timing to create psychological advantages became standard elements of military strategy. His ability to manipulate enemy psychology through strategic positioning and tactical innovation influenced military thinking for centuries. The really interesting part is what happened to Hannibal's dream-inspired tactics after his death. Roman commanders who had been defeated by Hannibal's innovations eventually learned to use them against their own enemies. The psychological warfare techniques Hannibal had learned from Mercury became part of Roman military doctrine. The administrative and logistical innovations Hannibal developed for his Alpine crossing also had lasting influence on military thinking. His techniques for managing multinational armies in hostile terrain became foundational principles of military logistics. Hannibal's dream-guided approach to mountain warfare influenced military thinking for centuries. His understanding that terrain could be used as a psychological weapon not just a tactical advantage, became a fundamental principle of military strategy. The really remarkable aspect of Hannibal's story is how his dream experience provided him with both the tactical knowledge and the psychological confidence necessary to attempt one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. Without this supernatural validation of his strategy, Hannibal might never have attempted the Alpine crossing that made him one of history's most famous military commanders. Hannibal's dream also gave him a unique perspective on the relationship between individual courage and collective achievement. Mercury had shown him that military success required not just tactical brilliance, but the ability to inspire soldiers to perform beyond their normal capabilities. The psychological techniques Hannibal learned from maintaining morale during extreme hardship became foundational principles of military leadership that influenced military thinking for centuries. His understanding that soldiers needed psychological preparation as much as physical training became a standard element of military education. Hannibal's dream experience also influenced his understanding of the relationship between military strategy and political objectives. Mercury had shown him that tactical victories were meaningless without strategic coherence and political support. The prophetic aspects of Hannibal's dream were perhaps the most psychologically challenging. He was receiving guidance that would make him temporarily successful, but he was also being shown that his ultimate defeat was inevitable due to factors beyond his control. This created a complex psychological dynamic where Hannibal was simultaneously confident and fatalistic. He understood that his tactical brilliance could win battles, but that strategic limitations would prevent him from winning the war. Hannibal's dream-guided strategy influenced military thinking far beyond its immediate tactical applications. His understanding that psychological factors were often more important than material advantages became a fundamental principle of military strategy that continues to influence military thinking today. The really fascinating aspect of Hannibal's story is how his dream experience provided him with a complete framework for understanding the relationship between individual courage, tactical innovation, and strategic achievement. He didn't just learn how to cross the Alps, he learned how to think strategically about the psychological dimensions of warfare. Hannibal's dream also gave him insights into the psychological factors that determine military success. Mercury had shown him that victory required not just tactical superiority, but the ability to understand and manipulate enemy psychology. The techniques Hannibal learned for using terrain, weather, and timing to create psychological advantages became standard elements of military strategy that are still studied in military academies today. His understanding that psychological preparation was as important as physical training influenced military education for centuries. Hannibal's dream experience demonstrates how individual psychological events can have historical consequences that extend far beyond their immediate military context. His supernatural education influenced military strategy, tactical innovation, and strategic thinking in ways that are still visible in modern military doctrine. The really remarkable thing about Hannibal's Alpine dream is how it provided him with both the knowledge and the psychological confidence necessary to attempt one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. Without this supernatural validation of his strategy, Hannibal might never have attempted the crossing that made him one of history's most influential military commanders. Our final main story takes us to the Mongolian steppes, where a tribal leader named Temujin had a dream that would create the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But before we get to the dream that changed everything, let me paint you a picture of what the Mongolian steppes were like in 1206. Imagine a landscape so vast and empty that it makes the American Great Plains look like a suburban backyard. We're talking about millions of square miles of grassland, desert, and mountains where the only permanent structures were the occasional sacred site and the bones of animals that had died during the brutal winters. The Mongol tribes weren't a unified people. They were dozens of separate groups that spent most of their time fighting each other over grazing rights, water sources, and the occasional caravan that was stupid enough to cross their territory without paying tribute. It was like a massive, never-ending clan feud where everyone was related to everyone else, but that just made the violence more personal and vicious. Before he became Genghis Khan, Temujin was just another tribal. chief struggling to survive in a landscape that was trying to kill him in about 50 different ways. His childhood had been a series of disasters that would have broken most people. His father was poisoned by rival tribes when Temujin was 9. His family was abandoned by their own tribe and left to starve. And he spent his teenage years being hunted by enemies who wanted to eliminate potential threats to their power. By 1206, Temujin had clawed his way to a position of relative strength through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and sheer ruthless determination. But he was still just one leader among many, controlling a federation of tribes that was constantly on the verge of falling apart. The Mongol tribes were fragmented in ways that went far beyond simple political disagreements. They had different dialects, different customs, different gods, and different ideas about how society should be organized. Some tribes were primarily nomadic herders, others were semi-agricultural, and a few were basically professional raiders who lived by stealing from their neighbors. The traditional Mongol social structure was based on blood relationships and hereditary nobility, which meant that leadership positions were inherited rather than earned. This system created a warrior aristocracy that was often more concerned with maintaining their privileges than with effective military leadership. But the biggest problem was that the Mongols were constantly fighting each other instead of their real enemies. While they were busy killing each other over grazing disputes, more organized enemies like the Jin dynasty in China and the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia were growing stronger and more threatening. The Jin dynasty, in particular, had developed a sophisticated strategy for managing the Mongol threat. They would provide weapons and supplies to different Mongol tribes, encouraging them to fight each other rather than uniting against Chinese interests. This divide-and-conquer approach was devastatingly effective and had kept the Mongols fragmented and weak for generations. Temujin understood that the traditional Mongol way of life was unsustainable. The steppes couldn't support unlimited population growth. The climate was becoming harsher, and external enemies were becoming stronger. Unless the Mongols could unite and adapt, they would eventually be conquered or exterminated by more organized civilizations. But unity seemed impossible. The tribal chiefs were too proud to submit to anyone else's authority. The blood feuds were too deep to be easily resolved, and the economic differences between tribes made cooperation extremely difficult. In 1206, the night before what would become the pivotal Kurultai tribal assembly, where he would be proclaimed Genghis Khan, Temujin had a dream that revealed the key to uniting not just the Mongol tribes, but conquering the entire known world. The dream came to him while he was camped on the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, a place that Mongols believed was the dwelling place of the eternal blue sky, their supreme deity. Temujin had been fasting and praying for days, asking for divine guidance about how to proceed with the unification of the tribes. In his dream, Temujin found himself standing on a vast plain that stretched to infinity in all directions. The sky above was a brilliant blue that seemed to pulse with divine energy, and the grass beneath his feet was so green and perfect that it seemed to glow with its own inner light. The landscape was familiar yet impossible. It was recognizably the Mongolian steppes, but perfected and idealized beyond anything that existed in the physical world. There were no harsh winds, no barren patches, no signs of the struggle for survival that defined normal steppe life. A golden Volf appeared to him, not just any Volf, but the legendary ancestor of all Mongol tribes. According to Mongol mythology, the first Mongol was born from the union of a blue-gray Volf and a fallow deer, and this golden Volf represented the divine ancestry of the Mongol people. The Volf was magnificent, larger than any earthly Volf, with fur that seemed to be made of actual gold threads and eyes that held the wisdom of all the spirits of the steppes. When it moved, its paws left prints that glowed with silver light, and its breath created clouds that formed shapes and symbols in the air. The Volf spoke to Temujin in a voice like thunder, but thunder that carried meaning rather than just sound. The words penetrated directly into Temujin's consciousness, bypassing his ears and speaking directly to his soul. The divine Volf explained that the secret to ultimate victory wasn't superior numbers or better weapons, but creating a military system based on absolute loyalty and merit rather than birth. The traditional Mongol system of hereditary leadership was holding back the true potential of the Mongol people. Sometimes the best organizational chart comes from a divine Volf. The Dream Volf showed Temujin's specific tactical innovations that would revolutionize warfare. The most important was the decimal system, organizing armies into units of 10, Arban, 100, Jagan, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000. This wasn't just a new way of counting soldiers, it was a completely new approach to military organization that would provide unprecedented flexibility and control. The decimal system would allow Mongol armies to divide and reunite rapidly, to adapt to different tactical situations, and to coordinate complex maneuvers over vast distances. It was like giving a military commander the ability to think with multiple brains simultaneously. But the Volf's tactical guidance went beyond just organization. He showed Temujin how to use psychological warfare to defeat enemies before battles even began. The key was creating a reputation for absolute ruthlessness toward enemies combined with absolute loyalty toward allies. The Dream Volf revealed that most enemies were defeated by fear before they ever faced Mongol armies in battle. By creating and maintaining a reputation for being unstoppable, Mongol forces could achieve victories that were psychologically rather than militarily based. The Volf also showed Temujin how to create a meritocratic system that would inspire absolute loyalty from warriors who had previously fought each other. By promoting leaders based on ability rather than birth, Mongol armies would be led by the most competent commanders rather than the most well-connected. But the dream went beyond military tactics. The Golden Volf showed Temujin a vision of the entire world, from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, from the Arctic to the Indian Ocean. This wasn't just a geographical education, it was a complete strategic briefing about the civilizations that existed beyond the steppes. The Volf showed him cities that didn't exist yet, trade routes that connected distant civilizations, and political opportunities that could be exploited to create a unified empire. Temujin saw Baghdad, Kiev, Beijing, and Delhi, cities he'd never heard of, but that would all eventually fall to Mongol forces. The dream vision included specific strategies for conquering different types of enemies. The Volf showed Temujin how to defeat the sophisticated siege warfare of Chinese cities, how to overcome the heavy cavalry of European knights, and how to adapt Mongol tactics to completely different terrains and climates. Chinese cities would fall to superior siege techniques and psychological warfare. European knights would be defeated by mobility and archery. Islamic armies would be overwhelmed by superior coordination and tactics. Each enemy type required different approaches, but all could be defeated using principles the Volf was teaching him. The Volf also revealed the importance of cultural and religious tolerance. Unlike previous steppe empires that had tried to impose their own customs on conquered peoples, the Mongol Empire would succeed by adapting to local conditions and incorporating useful elements from conquered civilizations. This wasn't just political wisdom, it was a complete philosophy of empire building that would allow the Mongols to govern diverse populations across vast distances. The Volf showed Temujin that lasting empire required not just military conquest, but administrative competence and cultural sophistication. The dream included specific guidance about how to manage the various religious and ethnic groups that would be incorporated into the Mongol Empire. The key was tolerance combined with firm control, allowing local customs to continue, while maintaining absolute political loyalty. But perhaps the most important aspect of the dream was the Volf's revelation about the nature of leadership itself. Traditional Mongol leadership was based on personal charisma and tribal loyalty. But the Volf showed Temujin that true leadership required the ability to inspire absolute loyalty from people who had no traditional reason to follow him. The Volf revealed that the secret to creating this kind of loyalty was combining merit-based advancement with absolute fairness in distribution of rewards and punishments. Warriors would follow leaders who gave them opportunities to advance based on their abilities rather than their birth. This meritocratic approach would also solve the problem of tribal fragmentation. Instead of competing tribes led by hereditary nobles, The Mongol Empire would be a unified force led by the most capable individuals regardless of their tribal origins. The Volf also showed Temujin specific techniques for maintaining discipline and morale in armies that would be campaigning thousands of miles from home. The key was creating a military culture where the army itself became the soldier's primary loyalty, transcending tribal and regional identities. When Temujin woke up, he immediately began implementing the organizational structure from his dream. The first step was restructuring the Mongol military according to the decimal system the Volf had shown him. This wasn't just a matter of reorganizing existing units. It required completely reimagining how Mongol armies would function. The decimal system allowed for unprecedented flexibility in military operations. Units could be combined and separated rapidly, allowing Mongol commanders to adapt to changing tactical situations without losing organizational coherence. But the organizational changes went beyond just military structure. Temujin began promoting leaders based on ability rather than birth, creating a meritocratic system that would inspire absolute loyalty from warriors who had previously fought each other. This was a revolutionary change that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Mongol society. Traditional tribal leaders who had inherited their positions suddenly found themselves competing with common warriors who had proven their abilities in battle. The psychological impact was enormous. Warriors who had been excluded from leadership positions because of their birth suddenly had opportunities to advance based on their abilities. This created a level of loyalty and motivation that had never existed in traditional Mongol society. Temujin also created a unified code of laws, the Yasa, that would govern the entire empire. This legal system was based on principles the Volf had shown him: absolute loyalty to the Khan, merit-based advancement, and severe punishment for disloyalty or cowardice. The Yasa wasn't just a legal code, it was a complete social system that would allow the Mongol Empire to function across vast distances and diverse populations. It provided the administrative framework necessary for governing an empire that would eventually span 3 continents. The psychological warfare techniques from his dream became signature Mongol tactics. The empire's reputation for absolute destruction of resistant cities, combined with generous treatment of those who surrendered, created a psychological environment where many enemies would surrender without fighting. This psychological approach was devastatingly effective. Word of Mongol ruthlessness would precede their armies, creating panic and demoralization that often achieved victory before battles were fought. But the psychological warfare was always combined with genuine military competence. Mongol armies were organized, disciplined, and tactically superior to most of their enemies. The psychological advantage was built on a foundation of real military capability. The dream-guided strategies led to the conquest of an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary, encompassing about 24 million square kilometers. This was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and it was created using organizational and tactical principles that Temujin had learned from a divine Volf. The Mongol Empire's impact on world history was enormous. It facilitated trade between East and West, spread technologies and ideas across continents, and created political and cultural connections that had never existed before. The Pax Mongolica created the first truly global trade network, connecting China, India, the Islamic world, and Europe in ways that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. The economic and cultural exchange facilitated by Mongol rule contributed to technological and intellectual developments that influenced the entire course of human civilization. What's remarkable is that the unity vision from Temujin's dream created a lasting impact that went far beyond military conquest. The Mongol Empire's administrative systems, legal codes, and cultural policies reflected the comprehensive nature of what he had seen in his sleep. The religious tolerance that became a hallmark of Mongol rule originated from the Volf's teaching that lasting empire required cultural adaptation rather than cultural dominance. This approach allowed the Mongols to govern diverse populations without creating the kind of religious conflicts that had destroyed previous empires. The meritocratic principles that Temujin learned from his dream Volf influenced political development throughout the Mongol Empire. The idea that leadership should be based on ability rather than birth became a foundational principle that influenced administrative practices across Asia and Europe. The military innovations that originated from Temujin's dream continued to influence warfare for centuries. The decimal system, the emphasis on mobility and flexibility, and the integration of psychological warfare with tactical competence became standard elements of military strategy. Sometimes the most complete organizational revolution comes from a single supernatural consultation. The really fascinating aspect of Temujin's dream is how it provided him with both tactical knowledge and strategic wisdom. He didn't just learn how to win battles. He learned how to create and maintain a political system that could govern the largest empire in human history. The Volf's guidance also gave Temujin a unique perspective on the relationship between military conquest and cultural development. He understood that lasting empire required not just military superiority, but administrative competence and cultural sophistication. This understanding influenced every aspect of Mongol imperial policy. The empire's legal systems, trade policies, and cultural practices all reflected the comprehensive vision that Temujin had received in his dream. The prophetic aspects of the dream were also remarkable. The Volf had shown Temujin not just immediate tactical opportunities, but a vision of global conquest that would take generations to complete. This long-term perspective influenced Mongol strategic thinking for centuries. The dream also provided Temujin with the psychological confidence necessary to attempt the unification of the Mongol tribes. Without this supernatural validation of his vision, he might never have had the courage to challenge the traditional tribal system that had governed steppe society for centuries. The techniques Temujin learned for inspiring loyalty across tribal boundaries became foundational principles of imperial governance. His understanding that loyalty could be created through merit-based advancement and fair treatment influenced political development throughout the Mongol Empire and beyond. The organizational innovations that originated from Temujin's dream continued to influence military and political development for centuries. The decimal system, the emphasis on meritocracy, and the integration of diverse populations became standard elements of imperial administration. Temujin's dream-guided approach to empire building also influenced the development of international trade and cultural exchange. The Mongol Empire's policies of religious tolerance and cultural adaptation created the conditions for unprecedented global interaction. The administrative systems that Temujin developed based on his dream guidance became models for imperial governance that influenced political development across Asia and Europe. The integration of military efficiency with administrative competence became a template for successful empire building. The really remarkable aspect of Temujin's story is how his dream experience provided him with a complete framework for understanding the relationship between military conquest, political organization, and cultural development. He didn't just learn tactics, he learned how to create a civilization. The Volf's guidance also gave Temujin insights into the psychological factors that determine political success. He understood that lasting authority required not just military power, but the ability to inspire loyalty and create institutional structures that could survive individual leaders. The techniques Temujin learned for managing diverse populations and integrating different cultural traditions became foundational principles of imperial administration. His understanding that empire required adaptation rather than domination influenced political development for centuries. Temujin's dream experience demonstrates how individual psychological events can have historical consequences that extend far beyond their immediate context. His supernatural education influenced military strategy, political theory, legal development, and cultural change in ways that shaped the entire course of world history. The really remarkable thing about Temujin's Volf dream is how it provided him with both the knowledge and the psychological confidence necessary to create the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Without this supernatural validation of his vision, the Mongol Empire might never have existed, and the entire trajectory of world history would have been different. The organizational principles that Temujin learned from his dream Volf became foundational elements of political and military development that continue to influence contemporary thinking about leadership, organization, and empire building. His vision of meritocratic governance and cultural tolerance created political models that remain relevant today. There's this fascinating story about Scipio Africanus, the Roman general who finally defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. Before that decisive battle, Scipio had a dream that completely changed his approach to fighting the Carthaginians. But first, let me give you some context about what Scipio was dealing with in 204 BC. This guy was essentially Rome's last hope against Hannibal, who had been terrorizing Italy for over a decade. Hannibal had crossed the Alps, destroyed multiple Roman armies, and was basically playing psychological warfare with the entire Roman Republic. Scipio was only 31 years old when he was given command of the Roman forces in Africa. Most Roman commanders had been trying to fight Hannibal defensively, essentially playing not to lose rather than playing to win. But Scipio understood that the only way to defeat Hannibal was to force him to fight on Roman terms, and that meant taking the war to Africa and threatening Carthage itself. The problem was that Hannibal was arguably the greatest tactical genius in military history. He had never lost a major battle, he understood Roman psychology better than most Romans, and he had spent 15 years perfecting his techniques for defeating Roman armies. The night before the Battle of Zama, Scipio had a dream that gave him the psychological and tactical insights. He needed to finally defeat the legendary Carthaginian general. In his dream, Scipio found himself in a vast library filled with scrolls that contained the tactical knowledge of every great general who had ever lived. The library was unlike anything in the Roman world. It was enormous, with shelves that stretched up beyond sight, and every scroll seemed to glow with its own inner light. The scrolls were organized not by author or subject, but by the problems they solved and the enemies they defeated. In the dream, Scipio could read the strategies of Alexander the Great, learning how the Macedonian king had used psychological warfare to defeat enemies who outnumbered him. He studied the defensive techniques of Leonidas at Thermopylae, understanding how a smaller force could use terrain and timing to neutralize superior numbers. But most importantly, the dream library contained detailed analyses of Hannibal's own tactics, written from perspectives that no living Roman had ever possessed. Scipio could read scrolls that explained Hannibal's psychological approach to warfare, his methods for inspiring loyalty in diverse armies, and most crucially, his tactical weaknesses. The dream library showed Scipio that Hannibal's greatest strength, his ability to adapt to any situation, was also his greatest weakness. Hannibal was so skilled at reading enemy psychology and responding to tactical changes that he had become dependent on his ability to outthink his opponents. By creating a battle scenario that required multiple simultaneous adaptations, Scipio could overwhelm even Hannibal's legendary tactical flexibility. The key was to present Hannibal with so many variables that even his genius couldn't process them all simultaneously. The dream revealed specific tactical innovations that would exploit Hannibal's psychological patterns. Scipio learned how to use deliberate confusion and apparent tactical mistakes to make Hannibal overthink his responses. Instead of trying to outsmart Hannibal, Scipio would make Hannibal outsmart himself. The dream library also showed Scipio something that no Roman intelligence had discovered: the psychological state of Hannibal's army. After 15 years of campaigning in Italy, Hannibal's soldiers were exhausted, homesick, and increasingly doubtful about their leader's ability to actually defeat Rome. Many of Hannibal's veteran soldiers were dead, and his army was now composed largely of raw recruits and reluctant allies. The psychological cohesion that had made Hannibal's forces so effective was beginning to fracture under the strain of prolonged warfare. Scipio woke up with a complete battle plan that involved deliberate confusion and apparent tactical mistakes designed to make Hannibal overthink his responses. The strategy was counterintuitive. Instead of trying to match Hannibal's tactical brilliance, Scipio would create situations where Hannibal's intelligence worked against him. The battle plan included specific psychological warfare techniques designed to exploit Hannibal's knowledge of Roman tactics. Scipio would use formations that appeared to be traditional Roman approaches, but with subtle modifications that would confuse Hannibal's tactical calculations. The dream guidance also revealed how to use Hannibal's own elephants against him. Instead of trying to counter the elephants directly, Scipio would create battlefield conditions where the elephants would become liabilities rather than assets. The strategy worked perfectly at Zama. Scipio's deliberate tactical confusion caused Hannibal to make uncharacteristic mistakes, and the psychological warfare techniques disrupted the morale of Carthaginian forces. For the first time in his career, Hannibal was outmaneuvered by a Roman general. Sometimes the best way to defeat a genius is to make them think too much. The victory at Zama didn't just end Hannibal's threat to Rome, it established Scipio as one of history's greatest military minds and demonstrated that even legendary tactical genius could be defeated through superior psychological understanding. Scipio's dream-guided approach to fighting Hannibal influenced Roman military thinking for centuries. His understanding that psychological warfare was often more important than tactical superiority became a foundational principle of Roman strategy. The technique Scipio learned for creating tactical confusion and exploiting enemy psychology became standard elements of military strategy that influenced warfare throughout the ancient world and beyond. Before the Norman conquest of England, William the Conqueror had a dream that showed him exactly how to defeat the Anglo-Saxon forces at the Battle of Hastings. The dream came to him while he was still planning his invasion, and it included specific details about English defensive positions and the psychological state of Harold Godwinson's army. But let me back up and explain just how insane William's situation was in 1066. This guy was essentially planning to invade another country based on a legal claim so complicated that it would take a team of medieval lawyers 3 days just to explain why he thought he had a right to the English throne. William was Duke of Normandy, which meant he controlled a chunk of northern France that was technically part of the French kingdom but operated more like an independent military state. The Normans were basically Vikings who had settled down, learned French, and developed a sophisticated approach to organized violence. The legal justification for William's invasion was that Edward the Confessor, the previous English king, had supposedly promised him the throne, and that Harold Godwinson had sworn an oath to support William's claim. Of course, Harold was now claiming that he'd been coerced into that oath and that Edward had changed his mind on his deathbed. It was like a medieval version of a contract dispute, except instead of going to court, they were going to settle it with armies trying to kill each other. Which, to be fair, was probably more efficient than the medieval legal system. William's strategic situation was challenging in ways that would make modern military planners break out in cold sweats. He had to transport an entire army across the English Channel, establish a beachhead on a hostile coast, and then defeat Harold's forces before they could organize the full defensive capabilities of the English kingdom. The English Channel might not seem like much today, but in 1066 it was a significant military obstacle. William needed favorable winds, calm seas, and enough ships to transport about 7,000 men along with their horses, weapons, and supplies. Medieval logistics were basically organized chaos under the best circumstances. Even if William managed to get his army across the Channel successfully, he'd be facing Harold Godwinson, who was fresh from defeating a massive Viking invasion at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Harold had just proven that he could handle serious military threats, and he'd be fighting on his home territory with the advantages of local knowledge and popular support. The English also had a significant tactical advantage in their use of the shield wall, a defensive formation that had proven devastatingly effective against cavalry charges. Norman tactics relied heavily on mounted knights, but the English shield wall was specifically designed to neutralize cavalry advantages. In William's dream, he saw the battlefield at Hastings with perfect clarity, the hill where the English would position themselves, the exact angle of approach that would maximize Norman advantages, and even the specific moment when Harold would be killed by an arrow. The dream was remarkably detailed. William could see the topography of the battlefield, including features that wouldn't be visible until his scouts actually reconnoitered the area. He saw where the English would establish their defensive line, how they would arrange their troops, and what their psychological state would be after their forced march from Yorkshire. The dream showed William that Harold's army would be exhausted from their rapid movement south after the Battle of Stamford Bridge. They'd been celebrating their victory over the Vikings, then forced to march 250 miles in a matter of days to respond to the Norman invasion. This exhaustion would be both physical and psychological. But the dream also revealed something that English chroniclers would never admit. Harold's forces were psychologically vulnerable because they were uncertain about the legitimacy of Harold's claim to the throne. Many English nobles had concerns about Harold's rapid coronation and his treatment of his rivals. The dream vision showed William that English morale was more fragile than their military reputation suggested. While they were formidable warriors, they were fighting for a king whose authority was questionable and whose strategic decisions were increasingly desperate. William learned from his dream that the key to victory wasn't just military superiority, but psychological warfare. The English were psychologically dependent on their defensive formations and their sense of fighting on home territory. By disrupting their psychological confidence, William could break their military effectiveness. The dream also revealed the importance of timing and patience. William saw that the English would expect a direct cavalry charge, and that their defensive preparations were designed to counter this type of attack. By using unexpected tactics and superior timing, Norman forces could overcome English defensive advantages. Most importantly, the dream showed William the famous feigned retreat that would break the English shield wall. This maneuver was so specific and counterintuitive that it's unlikely William would have conceived it without supernatural inspiration. The feigned retreat was a complex tactical maneuver that required precise timing and exceptional discipline. Norman cavalry would charge the English line, then appear to break and flee in panic. When English forces pursued them down the hill, breaking their defensive formation, the Norman cavalry would turn and attack the scattered English troops. This tactic was dangerous because it required Norman forces to appear genuinely defeated, which could easily turn into actual defeat if the timing was wrong or if the troops lost their nerve. It was the kind of high-risk maneuver that could either win the battle decisively or result in catastrophic failure. William's dream guidance also included specific details about how to manage the psychological aspects of the feigned retreat. He learned how to make the retreat appear convincing while maintaining enough control to execute the counterattack effectively. The dream revealed that English psychology was particularly vulnerable to this type of deception because their military culture emphasized aggressive pursuit of defeated enemies. Their warrior ethos would compel them to break formation and chase fleeing Normans, even though this would make them vulnerable to counterattack. William also learned from his dream how to coordinate different types of military units for maximum effectiveness. The battle plan included specific roles for Norman cavalry, infantry, and archers, with each unit contributing to the overall psychological and tactical pressure on English forces. The dream strategy was implemented exactly as William had seen it. The Battle of Hastings unfolded with remarkable similarity to his dream vision, including the successful feigned retreat that broke the English shield wall and led to Harold's death. Sometimes the most counterintuitive tactics are the most effective. The psychological impact of William's victory extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. His dream-guided strategy had not only defeated Harold's army, but had demonstrated that Norman tactical innovations could overcome traditional English defensive advantages. The victory at Hastings established Norman dominance in England and initiated a period of cultural and political transformation that would influence English development for centuries. William's dream-guided approach to psychological warfare became a template for subsequent Norman military campaigns. The tactical innovations William learned in his dream, particularly the coordinated use of cavalry, infantry, and archers, influenced European military development for generations. His understanding of how to exploit enemy psychology through unexpected maneuvers became a foundational principle of medieval warfare. William's successful invasion also demonstrated the importance of strategic patience and careful planning. His dream had shown him not just how to win the battle, but how to time the invasion for maximum psychological and tactical advantage. The Norman conquest that resulted from William's dream-guided victory had profound consequences for English language, culture, law, and political development. The fusion of Norman and Anglo-Saxon traditions created the foundation for medieval English civilization. Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem from the Crusaders was guided by a dream that showed him how to defeat the seemingly impregnable Crusader defenses. The dream came to him during the siege, when his forces were struggling against the city's fortifications. Now, let me set the scene for you, because Saladin's situation in 1187 was basically the medieval equivalent of trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while blindfolded and riding a camel. Jerusalem wasn't just any city, it was the most symbolically important place in the known world, defended by some of the most fanatical warriors in history. The Crusader states had been established nearly a century earlier, and by 1187 they had developed into sophisticated military societies that were essentially medieval versions of fortress nations. The Crusaders weren't just random European knights looking for adventure. They were professional soldiers who had spent generations perfecting the art of defending fortified positions in hostile territory. Jerusalem itself was a fortress within a fortress. The city was surrounded by massive walls that had been reinforced and improved over decades of Crusader occupation. These weren't just stone barriers, they were sophisticated defensive systems with overlapping fields of fire, multiple gate systems, and defensive positions that could channel attackers into killing zones. The Crusader defenders were commanded by some of the most experienced military leaders in the Christian world. These were men who had spent their entire adult lives fighting in the Holy Land, who understood siege warfare from both defensive and offensive perspectives, and who were absolutely convinced that they were fighting for the salvation of their souls. Saladin had been besieging Jerusalem for weeks, and his conventional attacks had been repulsed with heavy casualties. The Crusader defenses were too strong, their morale was too high, and their tactical position was too advantageous. Every assault had resulted in significant losses for Saladin's forces without achieving any meaningful progress. The psychological pressure on Saladin was enormous. He wasn't just trying to capture a city, he was attempting to reclaim the third holiest site in Islam from Christian occupiers who had held it for nearly 9 decades. Failure would mean not just military defeat, but spiritual humiliation for the entire Islamic world. Saladin's army was also becoming increasingly demoralized. They had expected a relatively quick victory based on Saladin's previous successes against Crusader forces, but Jerusalem was proving to be a completely different kind of challenge. The defenders were fighting with desperate courage, and the siege was dragging on longer than anyone had anticipated. In his dream, Saladin found himself inside Jerusalem's walls, but the city he saw was different from the Crusader stronghold he was besieging. This was Jerusalem as it had been before the Crusader conquest, a multicultural city where Muslims, Christians, and Jews had coexisted relatively peacefully under Islamic rule. The streets in his dream were filled with people of all faiths, going about their daily business without the fear and tension that characterized the Crusader-occupied city. Markets were bustling with merchants from across the known world, scholars were debating in multiple languages, and the city had the vibrant, cosmopolitan atmosphere that had made it famous throughout the medieval world. A figure appeared to him in the dream, an elderly man with a white beard, wearing simple robes that seemed to shimmer with divine light. Saladin recognized this figure as the Prophet Muhammad, though the Prophet's face was somehow both familiar and impossible to look at directly. The dream prophet spoke to Saladin in perfect Arabic, but his words carried meanings that went beyond normal language. He showed Saladin the exact location where the city's defenses were weakest, not physically weak, but psychologically vulnerable. The dream revealed that the Crusader defenders were more afraid of being seen as failures than they were of death. Their entire identity was built around their role as protectors of the Holy Land, and their psychological state was much more fragile than their military reputation suggested. The prophet showed Saladin that the key to victory wasn't breaking down the city's walls, but breaking down the defenders' confidence in their cause. The Crusaders could withstand physical assault, but they were vulnerable to psychological pressure that challenged their sense of righteousness. The dream guidance revealed specific details about the internal politics of the Crusader defense. There were significant tensions between different military orders, disagreements about defensive strategy, and growing concerns about the sustainability of their position. Many of the defending knights were beginning to doubt whether holding Jerusalem was actually God's will, especially given the enormous cost in Christian lives that the defense was requiring. These psychological fractures could be exploited more effectively than any physical weakness in the city's fortifications. The prophet also revealed the psychological key to victory, offering honorable surrender terms while demonstrating overwhelming force. The Crusaders were trapped between their fear of military defeat and their fear of spiritual failure. By providing them with a way to surrender without dishonor, Saladin could achieve victory without the massive casualties that would result from a direct assault. The dream showed Saladin exactly how to structure his surrender terms to appeal to Crusader psychology. Instead of demanding unconditional surrender, he should offer terms that would allow the defenders to maintain their honor while acknowledging the practical impossibility of their situation. The dream strategy also included specific timing for the psychological pressure. Saladin learned that the optimal moment for offering surrender terms would be immediately after demonstrating his ability to breach the walls, but before actually attempting to storm the city. This timing would maximize the psychological impact while minimizing actual casualties. The Crusaders would understand that defeat was inevitable, but they wouldn't be forced into the kind of desperate last stand that would result in massive bloodshed on both sides. When Saladin woke up, he immediately implemented the psychological warfare strategy from his dream. Instead of continuing his direct assaults on the walls, he began a campaign of psychological pressure designed to undermine Crusader morale and confidence. Saladin's new approach included highly visible preparations for a massive assault, combined with offers of honorable surrender terms. He demonstrated his overwhelming numerical superiority while simultaneously providing the defenders with a way to avoid the slaughter that would result from a successful siege. The psychological campaign was devastatingly effective. Crusader morale began to collapse as the defenders realized that their position was hopeless and that continued resistance would only result in unnecessary bloodshed. Saladin's dream-guided strategy led to the peaceful surrender of Jerusalem, an outcome that was psychologically devastating to the Crusader states but also established Saladin's reputation as a noble and honorable leader. Sometimes the most complete victories are the ones that don't require killing your enemies. The psychological impact of Jerusalem's surrender extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. Saladin's reputation for combining military effectiveness with honorable treatment of defeated enemies made him respected even by his Christian opponents. The peaceful recapture of Jerusalem also had important religious and political implications. Saladin's merciful treatment of the Christian population demonstrated Islamic tolerance and undermined Crusader propaganda about Muslim cruelty and fanaticism. Saladin's dream-guided approach to psychological warfare influenced Islamic military thinking for centuries. His understanding that enemy morale was often more important than enemy fortifications became a foundational principle of Islamic strategy. The techniques Saladin learned for combining overwhelming force with honorable surrender. Terms became standard elements of medieval warfare, influencing military conduct throughout the Middle East and Europe. Japanese military history includes the story of Takeda Shingen, who received his most effective mountain warfare tactics through a dream about fighting in terrain that matched his native Japanese mountains. But before we dive into Shingen's supernatural tactical education, let me paint you a picture of what 16th century Japan was like. The country was in the middle of what historians call the Sengoku period, basically a century-long free-for-all, where dozens of warlords were trying to unify Japan under their control through the traditional method of killing everyone who disagreed with them. Takeda Shingen was the daimyo of Kai province, which was essentially a mountainous region that most people considered too difficult to attack and too poor to be worth conquering anyway. But Shingen understood that the mountains weren't just a defensive barrier. They were a tactical laboratory where conventional warfare rules didn't apply. The problem was that most Japanese military thinking was based on fighting in relatively flat terrain where traditional samurai tactics could be employed effectively. Cavalry charges, formal duels between champions, and elaborate battlefield ceremonies worked fine when you had room to maneuver and visibility was good. But mountain warfare was completely different. The terrain was so steep and complex that traditional formations were impossible. Visibility was limited by forests and ridgelines, and weather conditions could change from sunshine to deadly storms in a matter of minutes. Most Japanese commanders avoided mountain campaigns whenever possible, and when they were forced to fight in mountainous terrain, they usually tried to adapt lowland tactics rather than developing specific mountain warfare techniques. Shingen had been studying the tactical challenges of mountain warfare for years, but he was struggling to develop effective strategies that could exploit the advantages of mountainous terrain while minimizing its dangers. In 1573, the night before a crucial campaign against the Wasugi clan, Shingen had a dream that would revolutionize Japanese mountain warfare tactics. In his dream, he found himself in a landscape of impossible steepness and complexity, where traditional cavalry charges were useless and victory required completely new approaches to mobility and positioning. The mountains in his dream were recognizably Japanese, but they were somehow more intense and challenging than any real terrain. The slopes were steeper, the forests were denser, and the weather was more unpredictable. It was like fighting in a landscape designed specifically to test the limits of military innovation. The dream showed Shingen that the key to mountain warfare wasn't trying to overcome the terrain's challenges, but learning to use those challenges as weapons against enemies who were less adapted to mountain conditions. In the dream, Shingen saw specific formations for mountain warfare that abandoned traditional Japanese military organization in favor of smaller, more flexible units that could operate independently in complex terrain. These weren't just modified versions of existing tactics, they were completely new approaches to military organization. The dream formations were based on units of 20 to 30 men who were trained to operate as independent tactical teams. Each unit included specialists in mountain climbing, weather prediction, and terrain navigation, along with traditional warriors armed with weapons adapted for mountain combat. These small units could move through mountain terrain much faster than traditional formations, and they could coordinate complex maneuvers using signal systems adapted for limited visibility conditions. Most importantly, they could operate effectively even when separated from command authority for extended periods. The dream also revealed psychological techniques for maintaining morale in harsh mountain conditions. Shingen learned that soldiers fighting in mountains faced unique psychological challenges: isolation, disorientation, and fear of the unknown terrain that required specific leadership approaches. The key was creating a military culture where soldiers were trained to see mountains as allies rather than obstacles. By teaching troops to read terrain, predict weather, and navigate complex landscapes, Shingen could create armies that were psychologically comfortable in conditions that would demoralize conventional forces. The dream guidance also included innovative uses of ashigaru, foot soldiers, that had never been attempted in Japanese warfare. Instead of using ashigaru as support troops for samurai cavalry, Shingen learned to use them as the primary tactical force in mountain operations. Ashigaru were better suited for mountain warfare than mounted samurai because they were more mobile, more adaptable to changing conditions, and less dependent on formal tactical structures. In mountain terrain, the traditional advantages of samurai cavalry were negated, while the flexibility and endurance of foot soldiers became crucial advantages. The dream showed Shingen specific techniques for training ashigaru in mountain warfare skills that went far beyond traditional military training. These included rock climbing, weather reading, camouflage, and survival techniques that would allow small units to operate independently for extended periods. But perhaps the most important innovation from Shingen's dream was the psychological approach to mountain warfare. He learned that mountains weren't just physical obstacles, they were psychological challenges that could be used to demoralize enemies who weren't prepared for mountain conditions. The dream revealed that most Japanese armies were psychologically dependent on formal battlefield organization and clear lines of authority. By forcing enemies to fight in conditions where traditional military structure was impossible, Shingen could create psychological chaos that was often more effective than physical attack. When Shingen woke up, he immediately began implementing the mountain warfare innovations from his dream. The first step was completely reorganizing his military structure to emphasize small, independent units rather than traditional large formations. This reorganization required retraining his entire army in techniques that had never been used in Japanese warfare. Samurai had to learn to fight on foot in terrain where their horses were useless, and Ashigaru had to develop skills that made them capable of independent tactical operations. Shingen also developed new weapons and equipment specifically designed for mountain warfare. These included lighter armor that provided mobility without sacrificing protection, specialized climbing equipment, and communication systems that could function in conditions where traditional battlefield signals were impossible. The psychological training was equally important. Shingen's troops learned to see mountains as tactical advantages rather than obstacles, and they developed the psychological resilience necessary for operating in isolated, dangerous conditions for extended periods. The dream-guided mountain warfare tactics were devastatingly effective. Shingen's forces could move through terrain that enemies considered impassable, appear in locations where they weren't expected, and fight effectively in conditions that demoralized conventional armies. Sometimes the best tactical innovations come from learning to love what your enemies fear. Shingen's mountain warfare techniques allowed him to defeat much larger forces by exploiting terrain advantages that traditional Japanese military thinking couldn't counter. His ability to operate effectively in mountainous terrain gave him strategic mobility that his enemies couldn't match. The psychological impact was equally important. Shingen's reputation for being able to fight anywhere, under any conditions, created a psychological advantage that often achieved victory before battles were fought. Shingen's dream-guided mountain warfare tactics influenced Japanese military thinking for centuries and played a crucial role in establishing the strategic principles that would eventually lead to the unification of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate. The techniques Shingen developed for training soldiers in complex terrain and harsh conditions became foundational elements of Japanese military doctrine that continued to influence military thinking well into the modern era. Throughout history, different cultures have understood the relationship between dreams and military strategy in fascinating ways. And honestly, the variety of explanations is almost as entertaining as the phenomenon itself. Let's start with the ancient world, where military commanders regularly consulting their dreams for tactical advice was considered as normal as checking the weather forecast. Ancient civilizations generally accepted that dreams were a legitimate source of strategic information, but they had wildly different ideas about how this whole supernatural military intelligence network actually functioned. In ancient Egypt, military commanders would sleep in temples before major battles, hoping to receive strategic guidance from the gods. The Egyptians had developed this into a sophisticated system where pharaohs and generals would undergo ritual purification, sleep on sacred ground, and then have their dreams interpreted by specialized priests who understood military symbolism. Egyptian military manuals, yes, they had those 4,000 years ago, actually included detailed instructions for interpreting different types of war dreams. Dreams about animals were associated with different tactical approaches. Lions suggested direct assault and overwhelming force. Serpents indicated the need for deception and indirect approaches. Birds meant that reconnaissance and intelligence gathering would be crucial for success. Hawks represented swift, decisive action. Crocodiles suggested the need for patience and defensive strategies. Cobras meant that poison, either literal toxins or psychological warfare, would be key to victory. It was like having a divine bestiary that translated animal symbolism into military doctrine. Ancient Egyptian generals had better dream interpretation skills than most modern people have Wi-Fi troubleshooting abilities. The Egyptians also believed that the quality of the dream temple affected the reliability of the military guidance received. Temples dedicated to warrior gods like Sekhmet or Montu were considered better sources for aggressive tactical advice, while temples to more peaceful deities might provide defensive strategies or diplomatic solutions. Egyptian dream interpretation for military purposes was so sophisticated that they had different categories of military dreams based on their source and reliability. Dreams that came during the first sleep were considered most reliable. Dreams just before dawn were thought to be prophetic. Dreams during illness or stress were considered unreliable and potentially deceptive. The really fascinating part is that Egyptian military records suggest this system actually worked. Archaeological evidence shows that several major Egyptian military victories were preceded by recorded dream consultations that accurately predicted enemy behavior, and optimal tactical approaches. The Greeks developed the concept of prophetic dreams specifically for military purposes. But being Greeks, they had to make it more complicated and philosophical than everyone else. Greek commanders would often consult dream interpreters called oniromancers, who specialized in extracting tactical information from sleep visions. Greek military culture accepted that the gods regularly provided strategic guidance through dreams, and many famous victories were attributed to divine inspiration received during sleep. But the Greeks also worried about the reliability of dream guidance, because their gods were notorious for being petty, vindictive, and occasionally just really bad at giving advice. The Greeks developed elaborate procedures for determining whether military dreams were genuine divine communications or just the result of eating too much cheese before bedtime. They would compare dreams from multiple commanders, look for consistency in symbolic content, and test dream guidance against practical military intelligence. Greek philosophers like Aristotle actually wrote about the psychological mechanisms behind military dreams, proposing that the stress of command might allow sleeping minds to process tactical information more effectively than conscious reasoning. This was remarkably advanced thinking for the 4th century BCE. The Greeks also believed that fallen warriors could return in dreams to provide tactical advice to their living comrades. This created a kind of supernatural military tradition where dead heroes could continue, contributing to Greek military success through dream consultations. Greek military training included instruction in dream interpretation, and many Greek generals kept detailed dream journals that were passed down as tactical manuals for future commanders. Some of these dream-based tactical insights became foundational elements of Greek military doctrine. Roman military tradition included the practice of incubation, deliberately sleeping in sacred places to receive strategic dreams. Roman generals would often spend nights in temples dedicated to Mars, the god of war, hoping to receive tactical visions that would guide their military decisions. The Romans, being practical people, developed sophisticated techniques for distinguishing between different types of military dreams. Somnium dreams were considered random mental noise with no tactical value. Visio dreams were believed to contain genuine strategic information that could be trusted for military planning. Roman military culture also included the concept of dream discipline, the idea that commanders had a responsibility to seek divine guidance through dreams before making major tactical decisions. Generals who ignored their dreams or failed to consult the gods properly could be held responsible for military failures. The Romans developed standardized procedures for recording and interpreting military dreams. They had official dream interpreters attached to major armies, and they kept detailed records of dream guidance that proved accurate or inaccurate over time. The Romans basically turned divine inspiration into a bureaucratic procedure, which is probably the most Roman thing imaginable. Roman military manuals included specific instructions for preparing for prophetic dreams, dietary restrictions, purification rituals, and sleeping positions that were believed to enhance the quality of divine communication. They took this stuff seriously enough to court-martial commanders who didn't follow proper dream consultation procedures. Chinese military philosophy, particularly as expressed in Sun Tzu's The Art of War, recognized that the mental and psychological aspects of warfare were often more important than physical tactics. Chinese commanders were trained to pay attention to their dreams as potential sources of strategic insight that could reveal enemy weaknesses or optimal timing for military operations. Chinese military culture included the concept of dream warfare, the idea that battles could be won or lost in the realm of sleep and psychological preparation. Chinese generals would often use meditation and dream techniques to prepare for battles and to understand their enemies' psychological vulnerabilities. The Chinese believed that successful military commanders needed to master 3 types of warfare: physical combat, psychological manipulation, and spiritual preparation. Dreams were considered crucial for the spiritual aspect, providing commanders with insights that couldn't be obtained through conventional intelligence gathering. Chinese military tradition included specific dream cultivation techniques designed to enhance a commander's ability to receive strategic guidance during sleep. These involved meditation practices, dietary modifications, and sleeping arrangements that were believed to improve the quality of military dreams. The ancient Chinese basically invented psychological warfare, and half of it happened during sleep. Traditional Chinese medicine included specific treatments for dream disorders that could affect military commanders. These conditions included inability to remember dreams, nightmares that interfered with strategic thinking, and dream confusion where commanders couldn't distinguish between genuine strategic insights and random mental activity. Chinese military academies taught dream interpretation as a standard part of military education, and many Chinese military classics include detailed discussions of how to use dreams for strategic planning and tactical innovation. Medieval European military culture had a complex relationship with military dreams that reflected the broader tensions between Christian theology and practical military necessity. Christian doctrine generally accepted that God could provide strategic guidance through dreams, but there was also suspicion that military dreams might be demonic in origin. Medieval knights and commanders were encouraged to pray for divine guidance in their dreams, but they were also warned against relying too heavily on dream-based strategies. The church developed elaborate procedures for determining whether military dreams were divine inspiration or demonic temptation designed to lead Christian armies into disaster. Medieval military culture included the concept of holy warfare, where Christian commanders were expected to seek divine approval for their military campaigns through dreams and visions. Many crusade leaders claimed to have received their strategic guidance through supernatural dreams that validated their military objectives. The church developed classification systems for different types of military dreams based on their theological implications. Dreams that supported church interests were considered divine. Dreams that contradicted church teaching were assumed to be demonic. Dreams that had no clear theological content were classified as natural psychological phenomena. Medieval military manuals included detailed instructions for distinguishing between divine and demonic dreams, with specific warning signs that indicated supernatural deception. These included dreams that encouraged unnecessary violence, strategies that seemed too easy to be realistic, and tactical advice that contradicted established military doctrine. Medieval military commanders had to worry about whether their dreams were from God, the devil, or just indigestion, which probably made strategic planning extremely complicated. Islamic military culture embraced the concept of strategic dreams as a legitimate form of divine guidance that could provide tactical advantages unavailable through conventional military intelligence. Islamic commanders regularly consulted dream interpreters and incorporated dream-based strategies into their military planning without the theological anxiety that characterized Christian approaches. Islamic military manuals included detailed instructions for interpreting military dreams and for using dream-based psychological warfare against enemies. Islamic culture particularly valued dreams that provided insight into enemy psychology and morale, viewing these as divine assistance in understanding the mental state of opposing forces. The Islamic concept of jihad included the idea that righteous warfare would be supported by divine guidance provided through dreams and visions. Many Islamic military leaders claim that their most successful strategies were revealed to them during sleep by Allah or by the Prophet Muhammad. Islamic military tradition included specific prayers and rituals designed to enhance the quality of strategic dreams, and many Islamic commanders kept detailed dream journals that were passed down as tactical manuals for future generations of military leaders. Medieval Japanese military culture included the practice of dream training, deliberately cultivating the ability to receive strategic information through sleep using meditation and spiritual preparation techniques borrowed from Buddhist and Shinto traditions. Samurai warriors were trained to use meditation and dream techniques to prepare for battle and to understand their enemy's psychological states. This training was considered as important as physical combat skills and tactical knowledge for successful military leadership. Japanese military culture recognized that the psychological aspects of warfare were often more important than physical tactics, and that dreams could provide crucial insight into the mental state of both allies and enemies. Many samurai kept detailed records of their military dreams and used these for strategic planning. Medieval Japanese warriors were basically doing psychological profiling through sleep, which is either incredibly advanced or completely insane. The really interesting development came during the Renaissance, when European military thinkers began trying to apply scientific reasoning to the phenomenon of military dreams. Instead of just accepting them as divine intervention, military theorists started asking whether there might be natural explanations for why some commanders seemed to receive accurate strategic information through their dreams. Renaissance military philosophers proposed that the stress and responsibility of command might enhance certain cognitive abilities during sleep, allowing commanders to process complex tactical information more effectively than during waking consciousness. This was a remarkably modern insight for the 16th century. The development of printing technology allowed military dream accounts to be preserved and distributed more widely, creating databases of military dream experiences that could be analyzed for patterns and reliability. This was probably the first attempt at systematic study of military dreams using empirical methods. Modern military psychology has begun to recognize that sleep and dreams play crucial roles in strategic thinking and decision-making that go beyond supernatural explanations. Military commanders often report that their best strategic insights come during sleep or in the transitional states between sleeping and waking consciousness. Contemporary military training includes instruction in the psychological aspects of warfare, and some modern military programs explicitly teach techniques for using sleep and dreams to enhance strategic thinking and problem-solving abilities. This isn't considered supernatural, it's understood as applied psychology that takes advantage of how the brain processes information during different states of consciousness. The relationship between sleep, dreams, and strategic thinking remains an active area of research in military psychology, with particular interest in how stress, fatigue, and psychological pressure affect commanders' decision-making abilities during extended military operations. Research has shown that many of the cognitive processes involved in strategic thinking, pattern recognition, creative problem-solving, and psychological assessment are enhanced during certain sleep states, suggesting that the historical emphasis on military dreams may have had a solid psychological foundation that we're only now beginning to understand scientifically. Modern neuroscience has revealed that the brain processes information differently during REM sleep, when most vivid dreams occur. During this stage, the brain makes connections between disparate pieces of information in ways that might not occur during normal waking consciousness, potentially explaining why some military leaders received accurate strategic insights through their dreams. The study of problem-solving dreams has shown that people can sometimes solve complex puzzles during sleep that they couldn't solve while awake. This suggests that the military commanders who claim to receive tactical guidance through dreams might have been accessing enhanced cognitive abilities rather than supernatural communication. Sometimes the most practical solutions come from the most impractical sources. Contemporary military psychology also recognizes that the confidence boost provided by believing in divine guidance could have significant tactical advantages, regardless of whether the dreams actually contained supernatural information. Commanders who believed they had divine support might take calculated risks that led to victory, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where belief in prophetic dreams actually improved military performance. The placebo effect in military leadership suggests that commanders who believe they have supernatural advantages might inspire more confidence in their troops and make more decisive strategic decisions. This psychological mechanism could explain the effectiveness of dream-guided military leadership without requiring belief in actual supernatural intervention. Modern military training increasingly recognizes that intuition and unconscious pattern recognition play important roles in tactical decision-making, especially in complex, rapidly changing situations where conscious analysis might be too slow or incomplete. What ancient commanders interpreted as divine guidance might have been sophisticated unconscious processing of tactical information. The integration of psychology, neuroscience, and military history has created new understanding of how human consciousness operates under extreme stress and how sleep states might enhance certain types of strategic thinking. This research suggests that military dreams might represent a form of enhanced cognitive processing rather than supernatural communication, but the practical benefits for military leadership remain significant regardless of the underlying mechanism. Before we drift off into the realm of sleep and dreams, let me share some lesser-known stories about military dreams that almost nobody talks about. These are the cases that fell through the cracks of history, the ones that are too strange for textbooks, but too well documented to ignore. The forgotten dream of Marcus Aurelius, 169 CE. There's this obscure account from the personal writings of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who led Rome during the Marcomannic Wars. In his private journal, he described a dream that completely changed his approach to leading armies. But first, let me give you some context about what Marcus Aurelius was dealing with in 169 CE. This guy wasn't just fighting barbarians, he was trying to hold together the entire Roman Empire while it was being attacked from multiple directions by German tribes who had finally figured out that Rome wasn't as invincible as everyone thought. The Marcomannic Wars were essentially Rome's Vietnam, a prolonged conflict against enemies who used guerrilla tactics, knew the terrain better than Roman forces, and were fighting for their homeland against foreign invaders. Roman legions that had conquered most of the known world were struggling against tribal warriors who disappeared into forests and reappeared where they weren't expected. Marcus Aurelius was simultaneously trying to be a military commander, a political leader, and a stoic philosopher, which was like trying to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle. The stress was enormous, and traditional Roman military tactics weren't working against enemies who refused to fight conventional battles. In the dream, Marcus Aurelius found himself in a vast field where every blade of grass was a Roman soldier, and every gust of wind represented the movement of enemy forces. He could see the entire war from a perspective that was simultaneously microscopic and cosmic, understanding how individual decisions affected the fate of the entire empire. The dream vision was unlike anything in Marcus Aurelius's philosophical training. Instead of abstract concepts about virtue and duty, he was seeing the practical reality of how human psychology functioned under extreme stress. Every soldier was an individual human being with fears, hopes, and breaking points. The field in his dream wasn't static. It was constantly changing as wains shifted the grass, representing how enemy movements affected Roman morale and tactical positioning. Marcus Aurelius could see patterns in the movement that revealed the psychological forces driving both Roman and barbarian behavior. The dream showed him that military leadership wasn't about commanding soldiers like pieces on a chessboard, but about understanding the psychological and philosophical forces that motivated human behavior in life-or-death situations. This insight led to tactical innovations that prioritized troop morale and psychological resilience over conventional military strength. Marcus Aurelius learned that soldiers needed to understand why they were fighting, not just how to fight. The barbarian tribes had the psychological advantage of defending their homeland, while Roman soldiers were fighting for abstract concepts like imperial glory and senatorial politics. The dream guidance revealed specific techniques for maintaining morale during extended campaigns in hostile territory. Marcus Aurelius learned how to use Stoic philosophy as a practical tool for military leadership, teaching soldiers to focus on what they could control rather than worrying about factors beyond their influence. Sometimes the best military strategy is understanding that soldiers are human beings with hopes and fears, not just weapons that walk around. The psychological insights from Marcus Aurelius's dream influenced his entire approach to the Marcomannic Wars. Instead of trying to win through superior force, he focused on creating psychological advantages that would make Roman soldiers more effective and barbarian resistance less sustainable. Marcus Aurelius developed new training techniques that prepared soldiers for the psychological challenges of fighting enemies who used unconventional tactics. He taught Roman legions to think like philosophers as well as warriors, understanding their own psychological states and those of their enemies. The dream-inspired leadership style emphasized communication, explanation, and psychological preparation rather than just discipline and obedience. Soldiers who understood the strategic objectives and philosophical justifications for their campaigns fought more effectively than those who were simply following orders. Marcus Aurelius's dream-guided military innovations influenced Roman military culture for generations and contributed to the philosophical foundations of Western military thought that emphasized the moral and psychological aspects of warfare rather than just tactical superiority. The siege engineer's dream, 1453, during the siege of Constantinople. There's a barely documented account of a Byzantine engineer named Kallinikos who had a dream that showed him how to defend the city against Ottoman cannons. Now, let me set the scene for what was happening in 1453, because this was basically the medieval equivalent of David versus Goliath, except David had a slingshot and Goliath had nuclear weapons. The Ottoman Empire under Mehmed II had developed artillery technology that could blast through walls that had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years. The Byzantines were defending a city that had been the center of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 11 centuries, but they were doing it with about 7,000 men against an Ottoman army of over 100,000. The walls that had protected Constantinople since the 5th century were being demolished by cannons that could fire stone balls weighing over 600 pounds. Kallinikos was one of the few Byzantine engineers who understood both traditional fortification and the new reality of gunpowder warfare. He'd been working desperately to develop defensive innovations that could counter Ottoman artillery advantages, but conventional approaches were proving inadequate. The psychological pressure was enormous. Kallinikos wasn't just trying to save a city, he was trying to preserve the last remnant of the Roman Empire that had existed for nearly 1,500 years. Failure would mean not just military defeat, but the end of an entire civilization. In his dream, Kallinikos found himself inside the city's walls, but the walls were made of water rather than stone. This wasn't just a weird dream image, it was a complete reconceptualization of how defensive fortifications could function in the age of gunpowder. The dream showed him that the key to defense wasn't making walls stronger, but making them more flexible and responsive to different types of attacks. Traditional stone fortifications were like trying to stop a river with a dam. They worked until the pressure became too great, and then they failed catastrophically. Water walls in the dream could absorb the impact of cannon fire without breaking, could reshape themselves to deflect attacks from different angles, and could be repaired instantly when damaged. This wasn't just fantasy, it was a metaphorical representation of adaptive defensive principles. Kallinikos learned from his dream how to create flexible defensive systems that could respond to artillery attacks rather than just trying to resist them. Instead of building walls that were simply thicker, he designed fortifications that could absorb and redirect the energy of cannon fire. The dream-inspired defensive innovations included mobile barriers that could be repositioned based on the direction of Ottoman attacks, psychological warfare techniques designed to demoralize besieging forces, and crowd control methods that would maintain civilian morale during extended bombardment. The mobile barriers were constructed using a combination of earth, wood, and fabric that could absorb cannon fire more effectively than solid stone. These barriers could be rebuilt quickly when damaged and repositioned to respond to changing tactical situations. Kallinikos also developed psychological warfare techniques based on his dream guidance. He learned how to use the city's religious and cultural significance to maintain defender morale while simultaneously undermining Ottoman confidence through strategic demonstrations of Byzantine resilience. The crowd control innovations were equally important. Kallinikos learned how to organize civilian populations to support the military defense without creating panic or interfering with military operations. This included evacuation procedures, communication systems, and resource distribution methods that maintained social order under extreme stress. The dream-inspired defensive innovations were so effective that they prolonged the siege by months, and may have changed the course of European history if they had been implemented earlier in the campaign. Ottoman forces that had expected to capture Constantinople within weeks found themselves engaged in a prolonged siege that tested their own psychological resilience. Kallinikos's dream-guided innovations were so effective that they were studied by military engineers for centuries afterward, though the original inspiration from his dream was forgotten over time. His adaptive defensive principles influenced fortress design throughout Europe and contributed to the development of more sophisticated approaches to defensive warfare in the gunpowder age. The navigator's battle dream, 1588, during the Spanish Armada campaign, there's an account of an English naval officer named Thomas Cavendish, who had a prophetic dream about the exact weather conditions that would affect the battle. But let me explain what Cavendish was dealing with in 1588, because this was basically the 16th century equivalent of predicting a hurricane while trying to coordinate a naval battle against the most powerful fleet in the world. The Spanish Armada wasn't just a bunch of ships, it was a floating invasion force designed to conquer England and restore Catholic rule under Spanish control. Cavendish was a relatively junior naval officer serving under Francis Drake, which meant he was responsible for navigation and weather prediction for English ships that were vastly outnumbered by Spanish forces. The English strategy depended on using superior seamanship and weather knowledge to overcome Spanish advantages in numbers and firepower. The problem was that weather prediction in 1588 was basically educated guesswork based on reading clouds, wind patterns, and the behavior of seabirds. Cavendish needed to predict weather conditions that would affect naval battles fought over several days in constantly changing maritime conditions. The psychological pressure was enormous. English naval officers knew that if they lost this battle, England would be invaded by Spanish forces and Protestant England would cease to exist. The entire future of English independence depended on naval tactics that required precise timing and weather knowledge. In his dream, Cavendish found himself sailing through waters that were both familiar and impossible, the English Channel, but with currents and wind patterns that defied normal navigation. The dream waters moved in ways that revealed the underlying forces affecting weather and tidal conditions. The dream showed Cavendish exactly how weather conditions would affect Spanish ship movements over the course of the battle. He could see how wind patterns would influence the maneuverability of different types of vessels, how tidal changes would affect the timing of naval engagements, and how weather would create tactical opportunities for English forces. The dream guidance included specific information about storm patterns that would develop during the battle period. Cavendish learned that severe weather would favor English ships, which were smaller and more maneuverable than Spanish galleons, but only if English commanders understood exactly when and how to exploit these weather advantages. The dream also revealed the psychological impact that weather would have on Spanish morale. Spanish sailors were experienced in Mediterranean conditions, but they were psychologically unprepared for the harsh weather patterns common in the English Channel during autumn storms. Cavendish learned from his dream how to use weather conditions as a psychological weapon against Spanish forces. By timing English attacks to coincide with weather that would maximize Spanish discomfort and disorientation, English naval commanders could achieve tactical advantages that went beyond simple military superiority. The dream-guided weather predictions allowed English naval commanders to position their forces optimally for the changing wind and tidal conditions that would affect the battle. This information was so accurate that it gave English forces decisive tactical advantages throughout the campaign. Sometimes the best naval intelligence comes from sleeping navigators who dream about impossible waters. The dream-guided naval tactics contributed to the English victory over the Spanish Armada, though Cavendish's dream was never officially recorded in naval histories, because it was considered too supernatural for official military records. His weather predictions were attributed to superior seamanship rather than supernatural guidance. This dream-guided victory helped establish English naval dominance and contributed to the development of England as a global maritime power, though the original inspiration from Cavendish's dream was lost to historical memory because official records preferred natural explanations for military success. Cavendish's dream-inspired understanding of weather patterns influenced English naval tactics for generations and contributed to the development of more sophisticated approaches to maritime warfare that integrated weather prediction with tactical planning in ways that gave English forces persistent advantages over their enemies. The techniques Cavendish learned for using weather as a tactical weapon became standard elements of English, naval doctrine that influenced maritime warfare throughout the Age of Sail and contributed to English success in subsequent naval conflicts against European powers. These forgotten dreams remind us that military history is filled with moments when the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness became blurred, and when the most practical decisions came from the most impractical sources. They demonstrate that throughout history, military commanders have found ways to access insights and information that transcended the normal limitations of human knowledge and intelligence gathering. The common thread in these obscure military dreams is how they provided commanders with perspectives that were impossible to achieve through conventional means, seeing warfare from cosmic viewpoints, understanding defensive principles through impossible metaphors, and predicting weather patterns through supernatural navigation. What's really fascinating is how these dream experiences consistently provided practical, actionable information that improved military effectiveness in measurable ways. Whether the source was supernatural or psychological, the results were tangible improvements in tactical decision-making and strategic planning. These stories also reveal how military innovation often comes from sources that official histories prefer to ignore or forget. The supernatural elements make modern historians uncomfortable, so the practical innovations get attributed to natural genius rather than acknowledging their origins in dream experiences. The psychological impact of believing in supernatural guidance may have been as important as any actual supernatural information. Commanders who believed they had divine support might have taken calculated risks and made decisive decisions that led to victory, creating self-fulfilling prophecies where belief in prophetic dreams actually improved military performance. Modern military psychology recognizes that confidence, decisiveness, and innovative thinking are crucial factors in military success, and that these psychological advantages can be enhanced through various means including belief in supernatural guidance, meditation practices, and enhanced pattern recognition during altered states of consciousness. The integration of historical research with contemporary understanding of psychology and neuroscience suggests that these military dreams might represent sophisticated forms of unconscious information processing rather than literal supernatural communication. But the practical benefits for military leadership remain significant regardless of the underlying mechanism. What's clear is that throughout history, military commanders who paid attention to their dreams and used them for strategic planning often achieved remarkable success, suggesting that there are aspects of human consciousness and information processing that we still don't fully understand, but that can provide genuine advantages in complex, high-stress decision-making situations. These forgotten stories remind us that military innovation and strategic insight can come from the most unexpected sources, and that the boundary between practical intelligence and supernatural guidance has always been more fluid than official histories suggest. If you're somehow still awake right now, which honestly would surprise me at this point, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. And more importantly, have you ever had a dream that gave you insight into solving a real-world problem? Maybe not conquering empires, but perhaps a creative solution to something you were struggling with? And hey, if you've enjoyed this journey through history's most strategically significant sleep experiences, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the weird intersections of dreams and human achievement. We'll be back next week with another exploration of how sleep and consciousness have shaped the course of human events. Maybe tonight you'll dream about something we discussed. Perhaps you'll find yourself strategizing alongside Alexander the Great, or receiving tactical advice from Napoleon in an ancient Egyptian tomb. Who knows? Maybe while you're sleeping, your mind will stumble upon solutions to problems you didn't even know you had. Sleep well, and remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought in the landscapes of our dreams. See you in your dreams.